Chapter 2233. Although the Lu Yen branch altar in Kunshe continent was only a branch altar in name, due to Gao Qingtu's support, not only were there elite disciples transferred from various altars, but its scale was also unprecedentedly large. There were more than 100 altars under its jurisdiction and millions of followers. In order to properly control this branch altar, the position of altar master was directly assumed by an elder sent by the main altar, and the chief protector was chosen from the protectors who had made great contributions in the branch altar. In order to prevent someone from holding this position for a long time, an altar master had to be changed every 100 years. During these 100 years, an elder called Yuan Qifeng had presided over this place. Although he wasn't Gao Qingtu's disciple, his talent was extremely high, and he was one of the few cultivators in the sect who could stand shoulder to shoulder with Tang Yu. However, seeing that he was about to leave this place in a few years, he had a headache because of a matter. According to the sect's rules, the next chief protector must be recommended by him. This was originally a good thing, but he had been unable to decide which protector under his jurisdiction to recommend. This was because if the person who was recommended achieved great merits in the future, then needless to say, he naturally had a good eye for talent. But if this person made a mistake, then he himself would also be implicated, so he had no choice but to be cautious. There were many protectors in the branch altar, but the chief protector must be selected from the few people with the highest cultivation. In this way, the scope was greatly reduced. He Feng, Chan Shan, Yang Yucheng, Meng, Elder Yuan's eyes drifted, as if he had thought of something unpleasant. He automatically skipped this name in his mind and directly thought of the next person. Just as he was thinking, the administrator outside the door said, "Elder, there are memorials sent by the administrators of the various altars." Elder Yuan said in a deep voice, "Bring them in." The administrator walked in, placed dozens of memorials on the table, bowed, and retreated. Elder Yuan picked up the memorials and looked through them one by one. He couldn't help but frown. Although these memorials were worded differently, they were undoubtedly talking about the same thing. The Yen sect's followers were in constant conflict with many surrounding sects, causing many disciples of both sides to be injured. In fact, the conflict between the Yen sect and the various sects had a long history. The Tao of the Yen sect didn't need external objects, and they didn't care about one's identity when accepting a disciple. As long as one was fated, one could enter the Tao. In addition, the existence of the realm gate made the large sects less and less restrained. Although the large sects wouldn't care about this, the Yen sect's influence was spread throughout the heavens. It was inevitable that some sects wouldn't give any face, and this was especially common in the Kunshe continent. On the surface, this continent seemed to be filled with boundless spiritual opportunity and countless treasures. It seemed that there was no need to worry about this. However, in reality, most of the territories that the various sects could roam were opened up by the seniors. Moreover, once there was no one stationed there, it would not be long before it would be occupied by demons and ferocious beasts again. It was already very difficult to maintain it now. However, the involvement of the Yen sect could be said to have thinned out the harvest that originally belonged to the various sections. The only thing he could do to solve this matter was to find a way to dispatch people to eliminate the great demons and monsters, and open up their own harvesting land for the Yen sect. At least he wouldn't need to fight with the various sects now. He pondered for a while. Now that he was in a dilemma about the candidate for the Great Guardian, it would be better to leave this matter to these few people. He would recommend whoever made the greatest contribution, and then he wouldn't need to worry about it anymore. At this moment, the disciple in charge said from outside, "Elder, just now, there's an order from the headquarter on the altar." Elder Yuan's expression froze, and he sat up straight. After muttering a few words, a talisman flew in and floated motionlessly in front of him. He took it and opened it. It said that after the sect destroyed a Luo sect branch altar, they escorted the altar master to the headquarter. However, he accidentally escaped from the realm gate. After strict investigation, it was found that this person's identity wasn't simple. It was very likely that he was the reincarnation of the spirit of creation, and it was very likely that he had come to the Kunshe continent. They wanted him to find a way to capture him and prevent him from entering the world to cause trouble. Seeing that this matter involved the spirit of creation, his eyelids couldn't help but twitch. He felt a little uncomfortable for no reason. After a while, he said, "Come in." The disciple in charge walked in and said, "Elder, what orders do you have?" "Daoren Yuan, where's Guardian Meng?" "Go and summon him to see me." The disciple in charge said, "Elder, Guardian Meng isn't in the altar." Elder Yuan frowned and asked, "Where did he go?" The disciple in charge said, "Someone saw the great guardian flying to the depths of the wasteland with Guardian Meng a few days ago. I think they're going to search for the treasures that the headquarters needs, but they haven't returned yet. Daoren Yuan, send a message to them, tell them to come back as soon as possible." The disciple in charge said awkwardly, "Elder, the great guardian and the others seem to have gone to the depths of the wasteland. We've already sent a few letters asking about them, but we haven't received any reply yet." Elder Yuan was displeased. "Why didn't you report this to me earlier?" The disciple in charge knelt down and said, "I'm sorry. Elder went to the headquarters a few days ago, and as soon as you came back, you've been busy with mundane affairs. I didn't dare to disturb you with such a small matter." Elder Yuan glanced at him and said, "Don't do this next time." The great guardian Duancheng had never been on good terms with him. It was obvious that the disciple in charge could tell that the great guardian Duancheng might be in trouble, so he intentionally delayed the news, which indirectly caused the great guardian Duancheng to suffer more. Elder Yuan actually didn't like this kind of behavior, but since he had already done it, he wouldn't be too harsh on his disciple. He pondered for a while and said, "Go and invite Guardian He here." The disciple in charge obeyed and left. Not long after, a cultivator in his 30s, wearing an elegant hat and a wide belt, came into the hall and bowed respectfully, saying, "Greetings, Elder Yuan." Elder Yuan nodded and called him to sit down, then said, "Just now, the headquarters sent down an edict saying that a spirit from beyond the heavens has entered our world. Our Yen sect has always guarded this generation strictly, so I need to find it as soon as possible, so that I can give an explanation to the headquarters. You've always been thorough in your work, and you're also reliable and capable. This time, I'll leave it to you." He Feng's spirit was roused. He also knew that Elder Yuan and Duancheng were about to return to the headquarters. At that time, the vacant position of the Great Guardian would definitely be chosen from among the guardians in the headquarters, and if he could complete the edict issued by the headquarters, then even if he didn't have to say that this position would definitely belong to him, he would definitely become a strong candidate that Elder Yuan would prioritize. However, he didn't agree rashly, and asked, "Elder, may I know the origin of this spirit from beyond the heavens, and what abilities does it have?" Elder Yuan was very satisfied with his attitude, but the matter of the spirit of creation was a secret of the sect, so he couldn't say it out loud, so he said, "The edict didn't say it in detail, only that there's an almighty being behind this spirit's back. If it's someone with a weak will, it's extremely likely that they'll be bewitched by its Tao, and it's even more impossible for low-level cultivators and mortals to resist." He Feng's expression immediately became a bit more serious. As expected, this matter wasn't that simple, and it might be even more troublesome than he had imagined. He pondered for a while, then said, "Although the Kunshi continent is vast, there are gods paying attention to all the countries of the human path. If they're the slightest bit careless, they'll expose their tracks. Although this fellow can bewitch people's hearts, it's most likely that he wouldn't dare to do so. It's more likely that he's looking for the encampment of some small sect, and turning them into his own followers of Tao. In this way, he can conceal himself, and also find a place to settle down." Elder Yuan saw that he was full of confidence, but he frowned imperceptibly. Compared to others, He Feng's work was the most reassuring, but he was also very conceited. Even though he appeared to be very kind to those of the same path on the surface, he looked down on many people in his heart. In the past, he could tolerate these small flaws, but if he really reached the position of the chief protector, this could become a fatal flaw. His thoughts turned, and he decided to give him a pointer, so he said, "The cultivation of my Yanjiao doesn't require spiritual opportunity, and I don't seek external things, but on the path, I need the support and assistance of those of the same path. Only then will I be successful in every endeavor. You must remember this." He Feng said respectfully, I'll remember Elder's teachings. With one look, Elder Yuan knew that he didn't really listen to him, but he was still a talent that could be nurtured, and he never made any mistakes in his work. It all depended on how the matter he was instructed to do this time. If it didn't work, it wouldn't be too late to replace him. At this moment, he heard a commotion outside, and he said unhappily, "What happened outside?" The managing disciple came in to report, it's Protector Meng who returned, and he even brought back a lot of demon corpses. Elder Yuan Daoren asked, "Is the chief protector also back?" The managing disciple lowered his head and said, "I haven't seen the chief protector." Elder Yuan felt that something was wrong, and said, "Call Protector Meng over immediately, I have something to ask him." After the managing disciple left, he gave a few more instructions to He Fang, telling him to resolve this matter as soon as possible, and that the people in the altar could cooperate with him. After He Fang agreed, he walked out of the mansion. He had only taken a few steps when he saw Meng Hu walking towards him. He felt contempt in his heart, but on the surface, he was polite and considerate. He bowed with a smile, and said, "So it's Protector Meng, you've returned. Greetings." Meng Hu walked like the wind, and he bowed to him, and said in a clear voice, "Protector Yang, greetings." He Fang's smile stiffened, and he said, "Protector Meng, I'm he." But before he could finish, Meng Hu had already walked into the mansion. He put away his smile, snorted, and left in a huff. After Meng Hu entered the mansion, he was brought to the inner hall by the managing disciple. When he saw Elder Yuan, he bowed and said, "Elder Yuan, greetings." Elder Yuan was reading the report, and he responded, "Since you're here, take a seat." He looked up and saw that Meng Hu was already sitting on the seat below him, and he could not help but choke. He coughed, put down the report, and said with a pleasant expression, "Not long ago, I went to the altar to visit the chief, and on the way, I met High Official Zhang. This is the talisman letter that he asked me to pass to you." As he spoke, he took out a talisman letter from his sleeve, and placed it on the table. In fact, he understood that it was not difficult for Zhang Chan to personally pass this letter to Meng Hu, but asking him to pass it to him was clearly telling him that Meng Hu was his disciple, and he wanted him to take care of him. He felt a little uncomfortable in his heart, but it was not that he did not want to give face to Zhang Chan, but he thought, "Don't you know the number of High Official Zhang's disciple? You still want me to take care of him?" Meng Hu summoned the letter, read it once, and put it into his sleeve. Seeing that he was sitting there calmly and did not say anything, Elder Yuan guessed that there was nothing serious involved, so he said, "I heard that you and Great Protector Duan went to the depths of the wasteland to search for treasures and materials. Since you've returned, where is Great Protector Duan?" Chapter 2234. Great Guardian. Meng Hu fell into deep thought. Elder Yuan's expression froze as he stared at him. After a while, Meng Hu sighed. That was in the autumn of the year before last. Great Guardian, Elder Yuan decisively cut him off. "I don't want to hear about that." Seeing that Meng Hu was about to speak again, he immediately cut him off. "Don't tell me about last year either." He paused for a while before continuing. "You can settle your dispute with Great Guardian yourself. What I'm asking you is, after you and Great Guardian left the division together, where did he go?" Meng Hu made an "oh" sound and said, "Even though I had planned to follow the head guardian, the journey did not last long. The head guardian advised me that it would be better for us to act separately. Otherwise, if we were to kill the demons, who would be credited to? I thought about it and felt that it made sense, so I parted ways with the Great Protector." Elder Yuan glanced at him. It was obvious that Great Guardian did not want to travel with him, so he used such a roundabout way. He said, "So, you never saw Great Guardian after that?" Meng Hu pondered for a while. When he was about to say something, Elder Yuan stretched out his hand to stop him. "That's enough. You don't have to say anything. I know." Just as he was about to send Meng Hu away, he suddenly thought of something inappropriate. Just now, although the matter of dealing with the creation spirit was handed over to He Fang, Meng Hu had been the one to deal with such matters previously. In fact, Elder Yuan had wanted to do so at first, but since he had already given the order, he could not take it back. He was afraid that Meng Hu would cause trouble if he found out about this. Elder Yuan's mind turned. He could only think of a way to send Meng Hu away. This way, they could avoid contact between the two sides, and also give Meng Hu some peace. After making up his mind, he said, "Protector Meng, in a few years, Great Protector Duan and I will step down from our positions and return to the headquarters. However, the position of Great Protector will have to be chosen from your generation. Among all the protectors, you have the highest cultivation. I also have my eyes on you. If you make a great contribution, I can recommend you to the position." Meng Hu gladly nodded and said, "Then I'll have to trouble you, Elder." Elder Yuan's breath slightly stagnated, but he suppressed it in the blink of an eye. He did his best to slow down his tone as he said, "Protector Meng, you need to understand that this matter has yet to be decided. Our Yen teaching has always been based on merit. I have a task here that I need to entrust to you. If you succeed, then the position of Great Protector will belong to you." Without waiting for Meng Hu to reply, he swiftly took out a talisman from his sleeve. Presently, the various sects and my Yen sect are rather at odds with each other. During these past few decades, I've had many conflicts with this generation, and there've even been quite a few disciples that have suffered injuries. I need you to find a way to mediate this matter. If you're able to successfully resolve this matter, then I'll fulfill my promise from before. There's no time to lose, so you can set out right now. I'll take care of the various Dharma altars and do my best to give you convenience. After sending Meng Hu away, he didn't know why, but his entire body felt relaxed, and a trace of a smile appeared on his face. He knew very well that the conflict between the Yen teaching and the outer sects wasn't accumulated in a day or two. This kind of matter was a fundamental conflict of interest, and in fact, it couldn't be resolved. However, he didn't expect Meng Hu to be able to accomplish it, and only needed to send him away for the time being. In this way, the position of Great Protector couldn't possibly fall onto Meng Hu. Otherwise, even if he returned to the headquarters, he would probably be trembling with fear every day, afraid that he would be implicated. After He Yifang left the mansion hall, he came to the side hall of the subaltar with a sullen face. He handed over a talisman and said to the guard, "I'm acting under the orders of Elder Yuan. Now I need to borrow the Celestial Observatory. I hope you can make an exception." There were only 2 Celestial Observatory in the Yen teaching. One was in the headquarters, and the other was placed here. It could be used to observe the changes in the spiritual vigor of a world. However, because there were some flaws left during the sacrificial refining back then, this object would consume a lot of precious materials every time it was activated. Therefore, if there was no order, it usually couldn't be used. Even though he came with an order this time, the guards still didn't have a good expression and said coldly, "You're only allowed to use it for an hour." Usually, He Yifang wouldn't care about the looks of others because to him, other than himself, everyone else was mediocre. However, for some reason, when he heard this, his heart was burning with anger. He secretly thought that when he took the position of Great Protector, the first thing he would do was to remove a group of people decisively so that the order could be passed smoothly. Otherwise, it would be like now, the entire subaltar looked huge, but in reality, each deacon had their own people that they were loyal to, so they couldn't use their power in one place. When the guard opened the hall door, he walked inside and saw that the Celestial Observatory was inverted on a square wooden plate like a hemisphere, which was a metaphor for the round sky and square earth. He walked closer and waved his sleeves. In a split second, countless pictures of mountains and rivers appeared in front of him. The chi dynamic inside was also revealed in front of him like the waves of water. Because he didn't have enough magic power, he didn't have the power to look at the entire Kunsher continent. However, if the otherworldly spirit landed in an extremely distant place after entering the world, then it might not be able to smoothly reach the territory occupied by the human Tao. Therefore, he only had to look at it up close. His gaze stared at it, gradually moving from the inside to the outside, gradually moving into the distance. After a long time, he suddenly exclaimed in surprise. There seemed to be a violent movement in a certain place. There were clearly traces left behind by a cultivator passing through the world sky, but he couldn't make out the specifics. He thought to himself, this might be the territory that the otherworldly spirit passed through. Although it's a distance away from the human Tao territory, it's not far. I should go and take a look. Although that place was remote and there were many evil and ferocious monsters, he had the protection talisman that Elder Yuan gave him, so he wasn't afraid of encountering any danger. Therefore, he took out the talisman and called for a large spirit boat, leaving the subaltar and heading in that direction. At the same time, on the other side, the corpses of several great demons were lying on the ground, without any signs of life. Great Protector Duancheng of the subaltar of Yan Yan stood in mid-air and looked at the cultivator he saved with his sleeves behind his back, saying, "Which sect are you from? Why are you here?" Yao Kenbei was still in a state of shock. Several great demons attacked him, and he thought that he would definitely die here. Fortunately, these great demons saw each other as a threat and threw him to the side. They first started fighting each other, and only then did he have a chance to breathe. However, when the outcome of the battle was decided, he wouldn't be able to escape either. Fortunately, his fate hadn't run out yet. Duancheng was originally killing demons nearby, but when he sensed the abnormal changes in the qi activity here, he rushed over and either killed or drove away these ferocious monsters, saving his life. Yao Kenbei composed himself and bowed, saying, "Wandering cultivator Yao Zhan, in search of a strange fruit, I accidentally entered the depths of the wasteland. Thank you for your help, senior." Duancheng glanced at him and saw that he only had a Yuanian cultivation base, so he didn't bother to waste his transcendence energy to watch him pass by. He asked directly, "Although you have the ability to conceal your qi activity, you couldn't have reached this place by yourself. Someone should have traveled with you. Where is this person now?" Yao Kenbei sighed, "Senior's eyes are like torches. I originally met a fellow Daoist traveling with me, but when he saw that he was deep in the wasteland and couldn't deal with the surrounding demons, he broke through the sky and went somewhere else." Duancheng said, "I see, but he really shouldn't have left you here alone." Yao Kenbei pretended to be hesitant, saying, "This is in the past, let's not mention his name. We might meet again in the future." Duancheng glanced at him and said, "It's up to you. Since we ran into each other on the way, then follow me. Once we leave this region, you can go wherever you want." Yao Kenbei hurriedly thanked him. Duancheng released a spirit boat and used his transcendence energy to pull him up. Then, he turned around and left. However, after a day, the two of them reached the border of the wasteland. He said, "Go east along this path, there shouldn't be any demons blocking your way." Yao Kenbei bowed and said, "May I know where senior is cultivating?" Duancheng waved his hand and said, "I don't need you to repay me. Let's go our separate ways from now on." After putting Yao Kenbei down, he kept the spirit boat and left. At this moment, Yao Kenbei let out a long sigh of relief. Just now, the reason why he didn't say Meng Hu's name was not because he was pretending to be benevolent, but because he could sense that Duancheng was a member of the Yen sect. He didn't know what relationship Meng Hu had with Meng Hu, but the two of them were from the same sect after all. If he said the truth and Meng Hu became suspicious of his identity, then he would be asking for trouble. Fortunately, now that he was out of the wasteland, he could find a random small sect and send these people into their sect's Tao technique. Then, he would find a place to cultivate diligently. When he obtained a shocking divine ability, he would naturally be able to do whatever he wanted in the world and not be afraid of anyone. At this moment, he thought about how he was almost killed by Meng Hu in the wasteland. He laughed coldly, thinking that when he achieved great success in his cultivation, he would definitely take revenge. With a tap of his foot, he soared into the sky and began to search for a suitable target. Half a month later, he set his eyes on a sect with about 100 people and entered the sect under the name of Visiting the Tao. During the banquet, he easily drew the sect leader's mind into his heart realm. In just an instant, the sect leader was subdued by his Tao technique. A few days later, under the arrangement of the sect master, he also reformed a few elders here. However, at this moment, he discovered something. The more cultivators that submitted to his Tao technique, the faster his cultivation improved. Moreover, he wasn't affected by the Tao technique like before. This discovery caused him to be overjoyed. If he was able to reform even more people, then it wouldn't be long before his cultivation would be able to rise another level. Thus, he set his sights on those disciples. Because the upper echelons of the sect had already fallen, it was naturally extremely easy for him to accomplish this. After he finished, he was obviously able to sense his cultivation slowly rising, and he was extremely satisfied with it. Moreover, he started to think about how to reform even more people. However, he didn't notice that every time he reformed a person, strands of black qi would appear out of thin air and seep into his body. At this moment, his body was already covered in a thin layer of black mist, and it was ceaselessly being pulled into the Wei spirit of creation. Actually, it wasn't just him. All the spirits of creation within the wasteland that had comprehended their own Tao technique were the same. Only those like Meng Hu who had avoided this Tao a long time ago, and just now, such an unusual situation hadn't occurred. Chapter 2235. In Qinghuan Palace, Zhang Yan sat cross-legged. He was observing the changes in Fengdu's and the others' qi activity through the layers of Weili. On the surface, it seemed that Fengdu's recruitment of the Weili was going smoothly. Although there were small changes every time, they were all dealt with smoothly. But just when he thought that this situation would continue, a strange feeling suddenly appeared in his mind. His eyes flashed slightly, and he knew that something must have gone wrong. He looked up at the changes in the mighty power of the spirit of creation and calculated in his heart for a moment. However, he found that according to his original deduction, the incarnation of the mighty power should arrive in 50 years. However, the situation had changed at this moment. At most, it would only take a few years for the incarnation of the mighty power to land among all beings. However, in such a short period of time, the accumulation of the mighty power that descended was very weak. Even if the incarnation appeared, it was impossible for it to be a match for Fengdu and the others. It would only be killed in vain, so there must be a backup plan. Almost at the same time, Hongdu also noticed that something was wrong. He took a few steps forward and stared at the changes in the Weili. After a moment, he also saw the problem. His goal was to attract enough mighty power from the spirit of creation and then kill them in batches. Therefore, he had to attract enough mighty power each time. If there was only a small amount, it would not be able to weaken the spirit of creation at all. Moreover, he had to drag it out. The more time passed, the higher the possibility of the spirit of creation returning. He suspected that the Weili incarnations of the creation spirit had sensed their actions and responded spontaneously after feeling threatened. Xiang Ju and the others were a step late, but they also noticed the situation. Xiang Ju thought for a moment and suggested, "Fellow Taoist, should we increase the power of our recruitment?" Hongdu did not dwell on this at all. He waved his hand and said, "This time, the outcome has been decided. There's no need to fix it. Victory or defeat is not decided in this round. After this, we'll try again. Next time, he won't be able to escape." He could see very clearly that after the spirit of creation Weili made a counterattack, it would not be easy to reverse it. Since he might not be able to block the loophole, he might as well ignore it. There was still a chance on his side. He glanced at the disappearing spirit light and waved his sleeve to disperse it. He said, "This thing is useless now." Although he had missed this opportunity and failed to achieve his goal, he did not feel the slightest bit upset. Instead, he was excited, as if he had found a good enough opponent. Since they were going to fight, they might as well have a good fight. Several years passed in the blink of an eye. Under the watchful eyes of the great virtues, a Weili broke through the tribulation power and fell into the all things. Everyone observed silently. As expected, due to the lack of accumulation, the Weili did not cause any big waves. It did not even move the all things. In terms of level, it might be a level lower than the ordinary spirit refinement cultivators. It would be easy to kill it. The Weili quickly condensed into a Taoist figure. However, the Taoist just now condensed, but the moment it appeared, it collapsed on the spot. The Weili immediately fell into the all things and quickly weakened from everyone's perception. Zhang Yan saw this and confirmed his previous judgment. If the scattered Weili drifted into the all things, it would be easy to deal with them. All they needed to do now was to kill the great virtues as well as the Weili. The current situation was undoubtedly due to the numerous shattered spirits of creation within the all that are. Although some of these broken spirits of creation had already entered the world, most of them were still hidden in the undiscovered places of creation. Unless the great virtues could find these places, it would be impossible to find these scattered Weili. From the looks of it, this time the spirits of creation's Weili were not so much attracted by the crowd, it was more like they were sent out on their own initiative. He thought about it and wondered if he should intervene. After some consideration, he felt that Fengdu and the others had enough ability to deal with this matter. If he intervened at this time, it might cause unnecessary conflict with Fengdu. Fengdu and the other four were also discussing this matter at this moment. Wei Ming said calmly, "It's impossible for the original body of the spirit of creation to know what we're doing in the all things, and the setup in front of us just happened to avoid us. It must be a thought transmitted when the incarnation of the mighty force was suppressed. However, if we don't make him collapse, then it's impossible for such a situation to happen again." Hong Do glanced at the purple-clothed Taoist and sneered. This fellow's Taoist technique had been suppressed, so it was impossible for him to repeat the previous change. Xiang Ju laughed and said, "There are indeed not many places of creation that have been revealed today. It seems that we can't grasp the spirits of creation within them, but we don't have to keep an eye on them. Those spirits of creation that have already reincarnated into the world can actually be used." He paused for a moment and waited for everyone to look over before he said, "I've been deducing recently, and I've noticed that there's an extremely rare opportunity right now. Perhaps we can push one of the spirits of creation to surmount that originally insurmountable barrier and make it be of use to us." Ji Zhuang said in a low voice, "Fellow Taoist, are you talking about pushing that person into the spirit refinement realm?" Xiang Ju nodded and said, "That's right. Once the incarnation of the spirits of creation achieves the spirit refinement realm, it is equivalent to washing away the original traces, and it will no longer be easily seized by the original." Wei Ming continued, "In this way, in order to protect itself, it may even lean towards me. It can be considered as an enemy against an enemy." Xiang Ju smiled and said, "Exactly." Hong Du, however, showed a look of disdain and said, "This kind of petty trick is just a small fight, how can it affect the overall situation? Later on, all you need to do is to continue to attract the Weili, there is no need to complicate matters." Seeing this, Xiang Ju did not say anything on the surface, but he secretly used his spirit to communicate to the other three, saying, "Fellow Taoist Fengdu disdains this method, I can do it myself." Heng Wu said, "Since fellow Taoist Fengdu does not allow it, aren't you afraid that he will blame you for doing it privately?" Xiang Ju said, "I am not doing this out of selfishness, but to increase the chances of success. As long as fellow Taoists are willing to work with me, even if fellow Taoist Fengdu blames me, I am willing to bear this matter alone." Everyone knew in their hearts that even if this matter did not succeed, it would not be a big deal, because even if the spirits of creation entered the spirit refinement realm, they would not be able to achieve the position of Vedanta. If it really went against their wishes, then it would be better to be directly thrown into eternal silence. This way, the original body of the spirits of creation would instead forever lose a part of their power. Wei Ming said, "Which spirit of creation are you going to use, fellow Taoist?" Xiang Ju looked at Ji Zhuang and said, "Fellow Taoist, under your Tao teachings, it seems like a spirit of creation has escaped and entered the world." Ji Zhuang said, "That's right, this person was captured by the Yanjiao sect, and was later interfered with by the spirit of creation Weili who descended into all things and was sent to Bushu Tian." Xiang Ju said, "Then this person can be used." Wei Ming said, "However, Bushu Tian is the territory of Taoist Xianyuan, we cannot interfere with it. If he finds out that something is wrong and kills him first, then wouldn't this plan be for naught?" Xiang Ju said, "That's why I need everyone's help. As long as you all work with me to conceal the heavenly secrets, I don't hope to completely deceive Taoist Xianyuan, I just hope to delay this matter for a while." Wei Ming said, I think we can give it a try. Ji Zhuang did not say anything to object, which was a tacit agreement. Heng Wu said, I hope everything goes as you say, otherwise we will not only displease Hongdu, but also offend Taoist Xianyuan. Xiang Ju smiled and said, fellow Taoist, you worry too much. I just now said that I have no selfish motives in this. If it wasn't for the fact that I'm afraid that Taoist Xianyuan will deliberately obstruct me, why not make this matter clear? On the land of Kunshe continent, Yifang came to the west on a flying boat. Soon, he found the traces of Yao Kanbei breaking into the boundary that day. He captured a wisp of qi activity and searched along it. However, he found the traces left behind by Meng Hu. It seemed that this person had traveled with Meng Hu. This discovery made him feel refreshed, because this way, even if the clues were lost, he could still go back and ask Meng Hu about this person's identity. In fact, if the two of them had a good relationship, then he could immediately ask about the situation, and it could also save a lot of unnecessary trouble. But first, he did not like Meng Hu, and second, as a strong competitor for the position of the chief protector, he did not want Meng Hu to get involved in this matter, so that he would not get a share of the credit. However, it wasn't long before he actually noticed Chief Protector Duan Cheng's aura, and he deduced the process from the traces he left behind. Duan Cheng ought to have been trapped in a dangerous situation and almost died here, but he was saved by Duan Cheng by chance. This discovery made him speechless. Originally, they did not need to do anything at all, a great enemy from beyond the heavens would have died here, but instead, he was saved by the cultivators of the human Tao. But then he thought that this was also good, because if not, how could he have the chance to make a contribution? And if this matter was handled properly, maybe he could even make Duan Cheng owe him a favor. He turned the flying boat, and followed the qi left behind. Not long after, he confirmed that the person had gone to a sect called Daxing Sect. In fact, Yao Kanbei had been very careful to hide his qi, but when he entered the realm, he was only at the Yuanying level, so there was naturally nowhere for him to hide in front of Yifang. Yifang looked down. It was just a small sect, and the person with the highest level of cultivation was only at the Yuanying level. Even if that deviant spirit was added, it was still not a match for him, so this time it should be a piece of cake. But he was a cautious person, and he calculated in his heart that the deviant spirit had escaped certain death a few times, so no matter how he looked at it, it seemed that he was full of luck. After thinking about it, he still felt that it was necessary to be safe, so he stopped the flying boat in the distance, created a magical power incarnation, and headed to where the sect was. Then he sat cross-legged, closed his eyes, and waited. However, it wasn't long before he felt his mind go into a trance, and then he noticed that he'd appeared in a strange place. His reaction was swift, and he immediately deduced that this ought to be some sort of illusory realm. He immediately concentrated his mind and wanted to leave. However, at this moment, he heard a boundless and sonorous voice that seemed to contain boundless truths. As soon as he heard it, his mind was involuntarily drawn in, and then he sank deeper and deeper. It seemed that after a long time, he slowly opened his eyes, and a strange smile appeared on his face. Chapter 2236. Zhang Yan soon saw that Feng Du and the others had begun to draw the Weili of the spirit of creation again. Obviously, they were still preparing to continue their original plan. This choice was not wrong in his opinion. Since it had already begun, it could not be stopped. However, the next time the spirit of creation's Weili came, it would not be like this. It should be a real collision. This time, the spirit of creation first sent a portion of its own power over, and then caused it to collapse. This was equivalent to taking a step forward and hiding the mighty force within everything, and when the mighty force descended once more, it would be able to gather the mighty force, causing the returned mighty force to rise once more. This would undoubtedly give Chen Shi an even greater advantage in the battle against Feng Du and the others. The way to break this was nothing more than to kill the broken spirit of creation, so that the Weili of the spirit of creation could not be relied on. However, for the time being, no one could do this. What Feng Du and the others could do was to confront it head-on. There was nothing to fear here. If Feng Du and the others were defeated, he could still come forward to remedy the situation. However, at this time, he suddenly noticed a wave of Pauline of Creation's Whaley coming in. He could not help but raise his eyebrows. Xiang Ju wanted Wei Ming and the others to help, saying that they could conceal their true intentions. But in fact, Zhang Yan's sensing ability was far more brilliant than they thought. As soon as they made a move, he immediately noticed it. Zhang Yan looked at the target of the Walian fusion. After thinking for a while, he understood the intention of this person. This was nothing more than to push a certain spirit of creation that reincarnated into the world to a higher level. This would not only thin the power of the original body of the spirit of creation, but also use it to fight against the original owner. There was really an opportunity here. Because the one who imprisoned ancestor Tai Heng and the others was now sending out a sense to tell some people that there was something leading to the upper realm. The Zhou Huanyuan jade was an object that almost stopped most cultivators who wanted to improve. Apart from places like Busu Heaven and Mirror Lake, it was rare to find it in other places where the essence of creation was slightly weaker. Therefore, even deity refinement cultivators had a hard time finding it. Obviously, this generation wanted to seize this rare opportunity. He pondered for a moment. If these people could really create spirit refinement cultivators of this level, then they would indeed be able to disperse the power of the spirit of creation. However, in reality, the effect would be next to nothing. One had to know that the difference between ordinary soul refinement cultivators and great virtue cultivators was like the difference between heaven and earth. However, the spirit of creation could fight against all of the great virtue cultivators on its own. Even if this power was lost, the impact on it would be negligible. He could tell from the Whaley that Taoist Feng Du did not intervene in this matter, which meant that he did not think that doing so would change anything. This time, it should be purely the idea of Xiang Jue and the others, but as long as they did not interfere with him, he did not need to pay much attention to them. Kunshe Continent, Great Channel Sect. After seeing He Fang leave, Yao Kanbei secretly breathed a sigh of relief. In reality, he could not control the minds of these people who had been purified. However, after this generation recognized his Tao, most of them would naturally stand on his side. Only a few people with special talents or a different view of the world would not do this. He Fang was obviously such a person. Fortunately, this person had accepted his Tao teachings. In order to ensure that he would not be exposed, he would not easily reveal his whereabouts. This time, he also obtained a harvest. Originally, after he purified the entire Great Channel sect, his cultivation had just reached the critical point of the Yuanying realm. Now that He Fang, a grotto heaven cultivator, had been purified by him, he had successfully leaped to this level. This made him extremely happy. From now on, he had the ability to escape from the world. If something went wrong, he could leave at any time. As long as he was careful, he would not fall into the previous dangerous situation. However, after he calmed down, he felt that this was not safe enough. Only when he reached the mortal transformation realm would he have the capital to run amok in the heavens. Therefore, now was not the time to relax. He could not help but ponder about his next goal. However, as his cultivation advanced, the harvest of purifying the lower generation disciples was not much. Only cultivators of the same generation could catch his eye. These people often had a lot of implications, so he had to be extra careful. If it was not for the fact that he could not purify demons and other species, he would have included them in his Tao. He picked up a map provided by the Great Channel sect and looked at it. His finger pointed somewhere and said to himself, "Why don't we go here first?" At this moment, he suddenly fell into a trance. He felt an inexplicable force penetrating his body. Then, many things appeared in his mind for no reason. After a moment, he woke up from his daze. A trace of surprise appeared on his face. Zhou Huanyuan Jade. In this instant, he suddenly knew that after a cultivator shed their mortal transformation, they would need the Zhou Huanyuan Jade to advance further. Not only that, but there was an opportunity right in front of him. His heart was burning with passion, and he thought to himself, from the perspective of heart illumination, as long as I can enter the mortal transformation realm, I will be able to sense the existence of that place, and then I can go and fight for the return of Zhou Yuan Jade. Right now, there are already many upper stage cultivators who have sensed the existence of that place, so I have to speed up. Even if I can't be the first to enter, I can't fall behind. For a moment, he was only thinking about how to get the item. He did not think about where this knowledge came from. It was as if he had automatically ignored it. After Xiang Ju and the others imbued Yao Kanbei with this information, and seeing that there were no accidents, they calmed down and continued to communicate with their divine wills. This matter is over. That Taoist priest Xianyuan did not notice. Thank you for your help. Heng Wu said, no need to thank us. We did not do it to help you. Since there is a chance to weaken the creation spirit, we will not let it go. Wei Ming said, it is just that this person will definitely compete with those of the same generation who are also affected by the Weili. Can he really win? Don't rejoice for nothing in the end. Xiang Ju smiled. There is no need to worry about that. These creation spirits are extraordinary. They are not something that those cultivators in the modern world can fight against. As long as he can successfully reach that place, it will not be difficult for him to get the item. Ji Zhuang said indifferently, in fact, it is not a big deal even if we lose the opportunity. Fellow Taoist Feng Du is right about one thing. These are only minor details and will not affect the overall situation. Xiang Ju smiled. But who would complain about having more chips in their hands? No matter what, this will help us deal with the creation spirit, so it is worth it. Ji Zhuang glanced at him and said, then we will wait and see. He Feng drove the flying vessel and circled around outside for over half a month. He cleared up his thoughts and decided what he should do in the future. The existence of the creation spirit must not be exposed, otherwise it would definitely implicate him. If he was firm in his Tao insight and ignored all of this, then there would naturally be no hindrance. However, the Tao technique of the creation spirit had placed the path of the Grand Tao in front of him, and it was utterly powerless to resist a cultivator that truly wanted to seek transcendence. From that moment onwards, he had abandoned the Tao technique that he had learned. Actually, he understood that if it was purely a comparison of Tao techniques, the teaching evolution technique might not be inferior to the Tao technique of the creation spirit. However, the higher the teaching evolution technique went, the more difficult it became. Moreover, one's mental state had to keep up as well. However, the Tao technique of the creation spirit did not pay attention to this. As long as one was willing to follow this Tao technique and was not afraid of losing oneself, then improving one's strength was actually an extremely simple matter. I can't return just like this. Elder Yuan will surely ask me about the outcome. Why don't I return after my cultivation improves a little? In this way, I can use the excuse that I've comprehended a Tao technique on the way, and that's why I was delayed. He drafted a letter right away and sent it back. Within it, he stated that he'd already noticed some clues and had to continue investigating it. However, it would require some time, and he asked the sect to wait patiently. After he finished doing this, he found a mountain and established a simple abode before entering into closed-door cultivation. Elder Yuan sat behind the table and looked at the fallen leaves that drifted down from the outside of the courtyard. It had already been 5 years since he'd sent He Feng and Meng Hu out, and only a short 3 years were left before he resigned from his position. Meng Hu was a problem that couldn't be solved, so he wasn't really concerned about it, nor did he want to know the outcome. It was fine so long as Meng Hu didn't wander around in front of him. During this period of time, he felt refreshed and there weren't so many annoying matters. However, He Feng was the next candidate for the position of Chief Protector, but since he'd sent a letter the last time, there hadn't been any news from him. If it wasn't for the fact that there was still no problem with the life tablet, he would have almost thought that He Feng had already met with misfortune. However, one shouldn't suspect a person he used. Since He Feng had entrusted this matter to him, then he shouldn't question or interfere within the time limit. Otherwise, if this matter were to be exposed, it would definitely be a blow to He Feng's reputation, and it would be extremely disadvantageous for him to take over the position of Chief Protector in the future. After waiting patiently for another year, he finally received a letter from He Feng. It said that He Fang had suddenly comprehended a Tao technique halfway through his journey, so he'd landed somewhere to comprehend it. At the same time, he'd sent a clone to continue investigating. Now that there were clues, he hoped that the branch altar could give him a few more days to finish this matter so that he could finish what he started. Although Elder Yuan was quite dissatisfied with He Fang's lack of response for a long time, this news was enough to make him feel gratified. The most important thing for the position of Chief Protector was the cultivation level of the cultivator. Previously, it was difficult to decide, mainly because no one's cultivation level could suppress their peers. However, if He Fang's cultivation level was higher than everyone else, then even without his recommendation, there would still be no doubt. This not only proved that He Fang had a discerning eye for talent, but also because there was no room for choice. Even if He Fang made a mistake in the future, he would not be implicated. To be honest, if He Fang had reached his current level, even if he hadn't completed the task at hand, it would still not hinder him from ascending to this position, and no one would say anything. He returned to the table. On it were He Fang, Meng Hu, and a few other jade talismans nameplates. He smiled, picked up He Fang's nameplate, and put it aside. Then, with a flick of his sleeve, the nameplates of the rest all fell to the corner. Chapter 2237. Another 2 years passed in the Kunchi continent. After He Fang sent the letter last time, he saw that Elder Yuan didn't send a letter to urge him. He knew that he had undoubtedly grasped the crux of the matter. If nothing unexpected happened, Elder Yuan had already decided that he would become the next great protector, so it wasn't important whether he could find the spirit of creation or not. Although he had obtained the Tao technique of the spirit of creation, he didn't want to withdraw from the Yinjiao for the time being. If he really became the great protector, then not only would he have an additional protective talisman, the resources he could use would also be incomparable to those of ordinary people. He sneered. By the time he sat in this position, it turned out that mediocre people could only look up to him. At this moment, even he himself didn't realize that although his Tao technique had become much more profound in these 2 years, the flaws in his mental state hadn't disappeared. Instead, they had expanded. As these thoughts ran through his mind, he also planned to find a way to meet Yao Kenbei. One was to completely resolve this matter and avoid future troubles. The other was to discuss how to spread this Tao technique. On the Tao path, the more people with the same Tao, the better. Moreover, once there were more people with the same Tao, they could help him share the pressure. Even if he were to be exposed in the future, he wouldn't be implicated. After making up his mind, he drafted a talisman letter and sent it to the Great Conduit sect with the protection of his Fa Li. At this moment, Yao Kanbei had used Tao techniques to illuminate several sects in these 2 years. In order to quickly enter the mortal metamorphosis level, he couldn't care too much about concealing himself. Fortunately, the sects of the Kunchi continent came from different worlds and didn't usually have much contact with each other. Moreover, cultivators often went into seclusion for long periods of time. Even if a sect didn't make any movements for tens or hundreds of years, it wouldn't attract too much attention. After receiving He Fang's letter, he thought about it and also felt that he should meet the other party. If he had the upper echelon of the Yanjiao branch to cover for him, then it would be much more convenient for him to do things. Therefore, he immediately wrote back and invited him to meet in the ravine behind the mountain tomorrow. 1 day later, the two arrived as agreed. Although it was the first time He Fang had met Yao Kenbei, he had already exchanged Tao techniques with him in the Heart Realm, so he didn't bother with pleasantries and directly stated his purpose of coming, saying that he was ordered by the branch altar to investigate this person. However, there had to be a conclusion to this matter, otherwise it wouldn't end so easily. Yao Kenbei pondered for a moment and said, "This matter is simple. I've already thought of a way to escape. I'll pretend to have a battle with fellow Taoist, and then create the illusion that I've escaped from the universe. This way, fellow Taoist can explain to the sect." He Fang shook his head and said, "It's not safe to do so. I've been investigating for many years. If I still let fellow Taoist escape in the end, it would be unjustifiable and might even arouse the altar master's suspicions. Moreover, this can only be done for a while. If fellow Taoist suffers any setbacks, I'm afraid he'll be exposed." Besides, even if fellow Taoist really escaped, it wouldn't be difficult for me to investigate your whereabouts with my ability to teach. After all, with the innate chaotic destruction vitality light, it was impossible for a grotto heaven cultivator to stay in the void primordial sea for a long time, unless he landed on a desolate star without any life. However, if he taught like this, he would have achieved his goal, because if he landed on such a place, he wouldn't be a threat to life. Yao Kanbei pondered for a moment and said, "The more I cover up, the more flaws there will be. Actually, I don't plan to stay in the Kunshu continent for long. Once I cultivate to the mortal metamorphosis level, I'll leave this place. This way, fellow Taoist won't have to worry about being seen through by the sect." He Fang said, "Then is 1 year enough?" Yao Kanbei frowned and said, "It's a little short." He Fang said, 2 years at most." Yao Kanbei pondered for a moment and said, "All right, 2 years it is." He also didn't want to drag it out for too long, otherwise, he might miss the opportunity. After 2 years, if everything went smoothly, with the speed at which his Tao technique improved, he should be able to satisfy the requirements of the attraction force. He Fang said, "Then let's do it this way, I'll try my best to cover for fellow Taoist." An hour later, the two mana powers clashed in the wasteland. After fighting for a few days, a ray of light broke through the sky and disappeared. Of course, this was just an illusion. Yao Kanbei indeed broke through the sky and earth, but he didn't leave. It was only a clone that went to the void primordial sea, and it would soon disappear. He Fang saw that there were no flaws in the setup this time, so he turned back to the branch altar. Hearing that he came back, Elder Yuan was relieved. He immediately summoned He Fang to see him and asked about the situation. He Fang told the excuse that he had already made up and apologized to Elder Yuan. "This time, it was because of my incompetence that I didn't manage to complete the task. In the end, I still let that bastard escape." Elder Yuan didn't blame him. Instead, he comforted him, "You don't have to blame yourself. The otherworldly spirits are hard to deal with. It's good enough that you were able to heavily injure them. At least, you drove away an external enemy. Later, I will report the truth to the headquarters. If that spirit doesn't come back, this matter will have nothing to do with us." The reason why he was so polite was because he saw that He Fang's cultivation had improved a lot. In this way, there was no doubt that he would be the chief protector. Since that was the case, there was no need for him to be too harsh on this matter. Seeing that there was nothing else, He Fang took his leave. Outside the door, he was very relieved. As a person of Yan Jiao, he naturally knew the methods of Yan Jiao. He knew that there wouldn't be any problems for at least a year. At this moment, a familiar voice suddenly came to his ears, "Protector Qi, greetings." Although He Fang felt that something was wrong, he felt that the other person seemed to be talking to him. He subconsciously returned the greeting, but when he looked up, he saw Meng Hu's back heading into the inner house. He was startled, and a hint of anger rose in his heart. "It's you again." He glared hatefully at the inner house door a few times. Then, he immediately realized that his state of mind seemed to be a little unstable recently. It was too easy to fluctuate. This should be due to his cultivation advancing too quickly. He adjusted his breathing slightly and tried hard to calm himself down. He thought to himself, "Fine, I won't argue with you for now. When I get back and get the position of chief protector, won't an ordinary protector be at my mercy?" At this moment, in the inner house, Elder Yuan looked at Meng Hu, who was minding his own business and sitting at the lower seat. Although he despised him in his heart, he had to put on a gentle expression on the surface. He said, "Protector Meng, why have you returned? Did you encounter some difficulties?" Meng Hu replied, "There are no difficulties. I'm here to report on my mission." Elder Yuan was shocked and said, "Why, could it be that the sects have already agreed to talk peace with me?" Meng Hu nodded and said, "That's right." Elder Yuan did not believe it and asked suspiciously, "How did Protector Meng do it? Can you tell me in detail?" Meng Hu said, "Elder asked me to mediate, so I went to those sects to greet them one by one. Fortunately, things went smoothly. Everyone agreed and was willing to live in harmony with my Yen sect. Elder Yuan glanced at Meng Hu and shook his head in his heart. He knew it would be like this. What was the use of such a promise? If the original conflict could be resolved with a few words, then why would he need to be troubled over it? However, he did not want to continue entangling with Meng Hu on this issue. Otherwise, the one who would have a headache in the end would only be him. He said, Protector Meng has also worked hard. Since you've returned, then rest for a period of time first before discussing other matters. After sending Meng Hu away, he immediately checked the matters of the talisman books for the past few years. However, he unexpectedly discovered that the relationship between the sects and Yen sect seemed to have improved in the past few years. Even the occasional conflicts were within the acceptable range. He did not know how Meng Hu did it. He had the intention to ask, but as soon as the thought appeared, he immediately extinguished it. Even though Meng Hu seemed to have done a meritorious deed, he still did not know what was going on. On the contrary, there was no doubt that He Fang would succeed as the great protector, so there was no need for him to meddle. After Yao Kanbei received He Fang's promise, his courage grew by a lot. He immediately made a move against those sects that were his targets. After an entire year, he had enlightened the cultivators of more than 20 sects and pretended that they were fighting each other. Even though these sects all belonged to the Xian Gate, because they came from different worlds and did not have any deep backgrounds, there was no one with enough weight to come forward to mediate. Even if there were some friends who came forward to persuade him, they were similarly dragged into Yaosanbei's heart realm and quickly fell into the enemy's hands. With these resources, Yao Kanbei finally reached the level of mortal metamorphosis and continued to act according to the law. However, as this action gradually expanded, it finally aroused the vigilance of the outside world. Especially since the conflicts between these sects were very stiff, as if they were forcibly molded. This made people suspect that there was another reason behind it. Not only that, the Yen sect's main altar sent a message to the branch altar. After a long period of investigation, they believed that if the spirit of creation was not lost in the void primordial sea, then it was still in the Kunshe continent. After Elder Yuan received this news, he did not dare to ignore it. He was afraid that the spirit of creation would really come back, so he looked for He Fang to continue handling this matter. Yao Kanbei could not care about these now. He had entered mortal metamorphosis in a year, and in another year, he believed that he would be able to advance to that almost perfect realm. This seemed unbelievable, but in reality, it was not impossible for the spirit of creation. After all, the spirit of creation was at least at the level of soul refinement. Cultivating in Taoist magic would only make them return to their original state. If it was willing to abandon itself and attach itself to Taoist magic, then without the Zhou Huan Yuan Jade blocking the way, it might be able to complete the path of cultivation in an instant. In the mountain and sea realm, on an island peak in the ocean, Hong Yu sat motionless for nearly 10 years. But at this time, he suddenly opened his eyes, and an unprecedented light flashed in them. Just now, he felt that the power of attraction had unexpectedly become a bit stronger. Although he had felt that the realm where the opportunity existed was beckoning him, he had been unable to enter it for a long time. There was a reason for this. If there were enough people seeking this opportunity, then the power of attraction would increase, and the door would open in advance. But if there were fewer people going with him, then he would have to wait for the moment when the opportunity truly arrived. If it weren't for this, he would not have had to run all over the place to invite Taiheng, Pan Qi, and even Yu Ling to go with him. Unfortunately, in the end, no one was willing to fight for this opportunity, so he could only wait silently. Now that such a situation had occurred, it was clear that there were people of the Taoist path who intended to seek this opportunity. He silently calculated for a moment, and discovered that the day was not far away. Perhaps within a few years, he would be able to see the results. Chapter 2238. As Yaosanbei's cultivation continued to improve, his sense of the beckoning force also became stronger. However, his cultivation was still a little short of perfection, so it was still difficult for him to proceed. However, it was no longer as easy as before for him to illuminate more cultivators. After entering the mortal metamorphosis level, the effect of illuminating lower generation cultivators was negligible. Only illuminating those of the same generation was useful. Mortal metamorphosis cultivators were mostly the pillars of the sections. Their every move was watched by countless people, and they were not as easy to deal with as those cultivators from before. In addition, those who cultivated to this level all had a firm Tao heart, and external methods could not easily shake them. Not only that, he had now encountered a problem. Due to the dozens of sects successively falling into conflict, and the scope was still expanding, this matter had finally aroused the vigilance of the surrounding sections. Many of them were sects with deep backgrounds, so if his actions were slightly inappropriate, he would probably be exposed in front of others. Because of this, he called He Fang over again and said, "Recently, there have been more and more people coming to investigate. If this continues, it will be disadvantageous to me. I wonder if fellow Taoist can think of a way to resolve this." He Fang pondered for a moment and said, "Then has fellow Taoist ever thought of temporarily delaying this?" Yao Qianbei repeatedly waved his hand and said with a resolute expression, "I'm afraid that won't work. Before I succeed, I will definitely not stop." He Fang pondered and said nothing. Yao Qianbei looked at him and said in a slightly low voice, "If there is no other choice, it seems that I can only abandon these fellow Taoists." Hearing this, He Fang raised his head and looked at him, saying, "What does fellow Taoist want to do?" Yao Qianbei said, "As long as these dozens of sects launch an attack and attract everyone's attention, this can temporarily conceal our existence." He Fang frowned, "This method can only delay for a while." Yao Qianbei said indifferently, "Fellow Taoist knows that I only need this little time." He Fang thought for a moment and said with a solemn expression, "I think fellow Taoist doesn't need to do this. I will try to help fellow Taoist conceal some more. It's hard to say more, but like what I said before, another year and a half is still possible." According to what Yao Qianbei had said last time, he would have to leave this place sooner or later. Then, everything that remained would be taken over by him. Of course, he didn't want to use up all of these fellow Taoists that he had painstakingly recruited into the Taoist law. If he could integrate them, he would be able to open up an even larger world in the future. Yao Qianbei revealed a hint of hesitation. Actually, he did not care about these cultivators. As long as he could obtain his own opportunities, it would be fine. However, these people were not puppets that could be manipulated at will. They also had their own thoughts. Right now, they were standing together with him only because they cultivated the same Tao and there was no conflict between them. If the order he gave was unreasonable, then he might not really listen to him. He asked, "Fellow Taoist, are you really confident?" He Fang said with certainty, "I am." Then, he added, "If I can't conceal it, fellow Taoist can act according to your heart." Judging from Elder Yuan's attitude, there was no longer any suspense about the position of Chief Protector. After another year, he would be able to sit on this position rightfully. If he could drag it until then, not to mention other things, he could at least suppress the voices within the Yen sect. As for the other sects, it looked like they were keeping a very close eye on things right now. However, he was very clear that as long as it did not involve his own personal interests, why would this person easily stand up for others? Yao Qianbei looked at him for a moment and said, "All right, then I will trust fellow Taoist this once." He Fang returned to the sect and immediately summoned his disciples over. He passed down many instructions. Under his series of arrangements, the disturbance temporarily calmed down. Another half a year passed by very quickly. It was getting closer and closer to the time when the positions of Altar Master and Chief Protector would change. At this time, under Elder Yuan's deliberate arrangements, many matters that originally belonged to the Chief Protector had been handed over to him. He originally thought that he could smoothly hold on until he sat on the position of Chief Protector. However, he still overestimated himself. Because no matter how close he was to that position, he had not actually sat on it yet. Duan Qing stood in the main hall of the Protector, frowning as he read the report sent by his disciples. The chaotic situation between the dozens of sects in recent days made him feel that something was wrong. Originally, the fights between the various sects had nothing to do with the Yen sect. However, news came from the main altar that it was very likely that the spirit of creation had not left the Kunshur continent. If this matter was caused by this person, then the consequences would be unthinkable. This matter was originally handed over to He Fang to handle, but there was no result even after so long. This made him very dissatisfied. When he investigated again, he found that there were many contradictions here. He pondered for a while. Even if this was a matter that Elder Yuan had instructed, it might involve the spirit of creation and the branch altar's safety. He didn't dare to neglect it. He knew that He Fang had already returned to the branch altar at this time, so he sent a disciple to invite him to give him an explanation. When He Fang received the letter, he immediately knew that the matter would not be good. He thought for a while, then took out a talisman from his sleeve. In a flash, a light rose, and Yao Canbei's figure appeared there. Seeing his serious expression, Yao Canbei asked, "Has there been a change in the situation?" He Fang said with a serious expression, "My branch altar's chief protector Duancheng has very likely sensed your traces." Yao Canbei's gaze became dangerous. "Are you unable to conceal it?" He Fang shook his head and said, "This person has always been swift and decisive in his actions. Moreover, once he has decided on something, he will never change his mind. Right now, he is calling me over for questioning only to give face to Elder Yuan who assigned me to handle this matter. Later, if there is even the slightest flaw in my words, he won't give me any chance to explain at all. I'm afraid that he will immediately take action." Yao Canbei said, "Then what does fellow Taoist want to do?" He Fang's gaze was calm as he said, "Since we still lack some resources, then what about Duancheng?" Yao Canbei smiled faintly and shook his head. "This person is able to become your branch altar's chief protector, his will and Tao are extraordinary. My Tao might not be able to do anything to him. You also need to look at the target to illuminate. Those with mental flaws are just the easiest to deal with just now." He Fang seemed to be talking about something that had nothing to do with him, "But he will come to find you." Yao Canbei chuckled a few times, and then the aura shook a little before disappearing. He Fang frowned and stood where he was. He really didn't know what Yao Canbei's final words meant. Could it be that something happened during the time he was away? His heart skipped a beat, or, he didn't continue thinking about it. He rubbed the space between his brows and turned to go outside, preparing to meet Duanqing first so that he could deal with this hurdle. At this moment, a disciple hurried over and bowed when he saw him. He said, Protector Duan has been waiting for you for a long time, and seems to be quite angry. Just now, he has already left." He Fang was startled, then his gaze flickered a few times. Without a doubt, this person reacted very quickly. Seeing that He Fang didn't come, he sensed that something was wrong and immediately prepared to act. The reason why He Fang didn't do anything to him was probably because he didn't have any concrete evidence in his hands, and he was wary of Elder Yuan, so he didn't want to make too much of a ruckus in the branch altar. He Fang thought about it and relaxed instead. The biggest mistake that Duancheng made was to think that he could solve this matter. Little did he know, compared to a few years ago, Yao Canbei was already very different. Moreover, another half a year had passed. At this moment, even he didn't know to what extent Yao Canbei's cultivation had advanced. Half a day later, there was an earth-shattering noise coming from the west. Elder Yuan's expression was solemn. It wasn't difficult for him to sense that Duancheng was fighting with someone, and the opponent's strength was definitely not weak. He wanted to go and help, but the branch altar had its own rules. If there was an enemy, between the branch master and the chief protector, one must stay in the branch altar and not leave at the same time. Otherwise, if there was no one to guard the array, not to mention the enemy, even a fierce monster could cause great damage to the branch altar. What caused him to be even more infuriated was that Duancheng utterly didn't notify him before he left, causing him to not even know who his enemy was. In his helplessness, he could only draft a few letters and send them to the headquarters and the sects he was on good terms with, hoping that help would arrive in time. However, after only an hour, Duancheng began to retreat and his qi movement became weak. Elder Yuan knew that this was caused by Duancheng's continuous retreat. Once his spiritual energy was exhausted, the result would be obvious. However, even as his anxiety mounted, the worst-case scenario did not occur. For some unknown reason, the enemy's chi movements suddenly disappeared. Back in the ingenious space world, Bai Wei's spirits were lifted. Just now, he could sense that the Weili was becoming strangely active. However, even with his magical power, it was difficult to determine the source of that power. All he could tell was that it was definitely from an almighty upper realm expert. If it weren't for the fact that he couldn't do it, he would have gone in to take a look himself. Sighing, he ordered 2 of his disciples to come over and sit down. Now that the opportunity has arrived, he said. You can go there now. Remember, if you can fight, then fight. If you can't, then remember to stop. The 2 disciples respectfully complied, and then left. Bai Wei could sense that as soon as they left the temple, the chi movement had disappeared, and knew that they had already gone to the other side of the mountain. After a moment's examination, he discovered that Deng Zhang and the 6 devil masters had also sent their disciples into the other side of the mountain. After a moment of thought, he said, "It doesn't matter if my disciples can't get their hands on the profound stones. As long as they don't fall into the hands of the Tao realm. Mountain and sea realm. Nameless island peak." Hong Yu slowly rose to his feet. In front of him, a tiny speck of light suddenly appeared, as dazzling and intense as the heavenly sun. The wheel of light slowly grew larger, and as it spun, it grew larger, causing the wind to howl and the sea to churn. His pupils constricted slightly. He could sense that, just now, if that power exploded out, the entire mountain and sea realm would collapse. However, a moment later, before the power could even spill out, it was easily swallowed up by another power of some unknown origin. It didn't even cause any damage to anything in the area. It was at this point that the result he had been waiting for happened. A hole appeared in the middle of the wheel of light, as if there was nothing inside of it. When he saw that, his eyes shone brightly, and without any hesitation, he flicked his sleeve and disappeared into the hole. Chapter 2239. After Yao Canbei's conversation with He Fang, he did not believe that He Fang could really suppress everything in the outside world. Therefore, after He Fang left, he did not go to enlighten others, but instead entered the heart realm to cultivate and improve his cultivation. This kind of method was likely to wear away at his ego, drive away his nature, and turn to the path. However, in the face of such a great opportunity, he felt that it was worth it. Moreover, if he could find Yuan Jade and cultivate to true yang, he would be able to find his original self. If he could go to a higher level in the future, he would be able to completely break away from the shackles of the spirit of creation. However, within half a year, he finally succeeded in pushing his cultivation to perfection without caring about the price. Not only that, his state of mind that was originally full of holes was instead filled up because he was close to the path. Therefore, Duan Qing came at a very bad time. If he came a little earlier, Yao Canbei might not be his opponent, but unfortunately, the latter's cultivation had already reached perfection. Fortunately, Duan Qing had a bit of luck. Just as he was gradually unable to hold on and was about to be killed on the spot, the summoning force from beyond the heavens suddenly reached its peak in an instant. When Yao Canbei sensed this change, he did not even think and immediately gave up on chasing Duan Qing, directly rushing towards the domain where the opportunity was. He thought very clearly that if he missed this opportunity, he might not be able to go there in the future. If he returned with great success, what would a mere Duan Qing amount to? In the land of creation, Xiang Ju glanced at a certain place and said with a double meaning, "The chess piece that we set up has already gone to find the path of fate. Whether or not he can live up to our wishes will all depend on his luck." Wei Ming said, "If we give him some ability, perhaps this matter will be more stable." Xiang Ju smiled, "If he is tainted by our Weili, I'm afraid he will not be able to go to the land of opportunity." Wei Ming sighed, "I never thought that we would also have to go to the present world to set up a method." Even though Yao Canbei was a creation spirit that reincarnated into the world, he had not transcended the present world. If he was not attached to Bu Su Tian, he would have only been a fleeting existence. Under normal circumstances, they would not have paid much attention to him because it was meaningless. Xiang Ju smiled. "It may be a small matter, but the implications are great. He looked at everyone. The Tao has entered everything, and everything is the Tao. Now, not only do we need to look up, we also need to look down. What do you think, fellow Taoists? Heng Wu nodded and sighed emotionally. The essence of creation is shattered, and the Tao is divided into two. One is high and indistinct, and the other is entering the world. If I give up one, I won't be able to take care of both. Wei Ming shook his head and said, with a stubborn enemy in front of us, how can we care about the Tao? Ji Zhuang remained silent. Even though he agreed with the plan, it did not mean that he had no opinion of Xiang Jue and the others. From his point of view, they could have waited for the right opportunity. If they did not get Heng Du here, why would they need to be so radical? Heng Yu carried 2 swords on his back, and the corners of his robe fluttered slightly. He was walking on a small path between the mountains. The mountain walls on both sides were smooth as if they were made of iron. It was as if he had returned to the prison world, but it did not affect his state of mind at all. He continued to walk on the only path with determination. There was no passage of time here, and the surrounding scenery did not change. The qi activity in his body had almost stopped, and his senses were also reduced to the lowest. Other than being able to confirm that the opportunity existed in a certain place, it seemed that he could no longer distinguish anything else. However, his footsteps did not slow down at all. It seemed that as long as he did not find what he wanted, he would continue to walk, and he would not stop until the day of his death. After a long time, the front suddenly widened, and the mountain wall retreated behind him. He had walked out of the small path. At this moment, he saw a young Taoist walking out from the same mountain path on the right. He glanced at the young Taoist and knew that the young Taoist was not from the human Tao path. However, he paid no further attention to the young Taoist, and he continued to follow the faint feeling he had. Before he saw the opportunity, he would not take the initiative to enter into conflict with another. No matter what the other's identity was, it was all the same in his eyes. Moreover, he only had a single true opponent. The young Taoist smiled when he saw him leave indifferently, and then he cupped his fists and said, "Fellow Taoist, please wait. Fang Liang greets you." Heng Yu's footsteps stopped, and then he turned around and returned the greeting. He said, "Heng Yu, what is it?" Fang Liang said, "Fellow Taoist has come to search for the fortune of the upper realm." Heng Yu said, "Since I was able to come here, it's naturally because of fortune." Fang Liang laughed heartily and said, "Then I can't let you leave so easily. You're a cultivator of the human Tao path, so you'll be an opponent of mine in the end. If I'm able to deal with you here, then wouldn't I have one less opponent?" Heng Yu nodded, and without any hesitation, he immediately made a hand seal with his sword. In the next moment, there was the sound of a sword ringing, and the yang sword had already leaped out of the yin-yang sword on his back, slashing towards the young Taoist. The young Taoist laughed softly, and then stretched out 2 fingers to lightly push the sword light. He actually managed to push the yang sword away. However, at this moment, his expression changed. He saw that another yin sword had separated from the yang sword, slashing towards him. At this moment, he was actually unable to move. He immediately dove into an unknown state, and used his divine intent to calculate repeatedly. He discovered that this sword was profound and unpredictable, and even if he took out his Dharma treasure, he was not confident that he could block it. Thus, he immediately moved his root fruit, wanting to avoid this slash. However, the moment he took out his root fruit, his vision became blurry, and the yin sword suddenly disappeared, as if it was just an illusion. His heart tightened. The miraculousness of his opponent's sword technique was secondary, the key was the Taoist spell it displayed. He felt that something was wrong, and afraid that his root fruit would be calculated, he quickly retreated. However, he heard the sound of a sword ringing, and he saw the yang sword slashing towards his head, and he was just about to push it away. This scene seemed to have returned to the scene just now. At this moment, he found that it was difficult for him to determine whether what he was seeing was real or fake, and his mind could not help but waver slightly. This was originally an extremely small opening, but Heng Yu immediately grasped it. He first slashed at the void, striking the Taoist's mind, making it difficult for him to move his root fruit. Next, he slashed at the Taoist's body. The moment the sword slashed down, all the Fa Li in his body seemed to pour out, and the young Taoist was instantly slashed into a ball of essence qi. At this stage, there was no chance for him to turn the tables. Once the essence qi gathered, it would be destroyed by him again. After an unknown number of times, all the essence qi and Fa Li in his body were finally used up, until there was nothing left. Hong Yu's expression did not change at all. With a thought, the external yang sword suddenly disappeared, and when it reappeared, it had already returned to the sheath. His sword technique was illusory, the separation of yin and yang. It looked simple, but in reality, he had already cultivated it to the extreme. However, he was able to obtain first place in the sword battle of the 16 sects in the past, and it was not purely because of his exquisite sword technique, but because he was good in all aspects. It was just that when facing ordinary opponents, he could only use his sword technique to deal with them, and his real technique was still reserved for an opponent that he had always regarded as a great enemy. After Yao Kanbei crossed the realm gate, he found himself on a white plain. The land stretched out, and there was no end to it. All directions were the same, and it was as if there were only heaven and earth left in this realm, and it was so clean that it was almost monotonous. He originally wanted to fly up into the sky, but when he turned his Fa Li, he found that he could not fly here, and the operation of his Fa Li also became abnormally difficult, and it was very difficult to stir the heaven and earth. He was a little surprised. The Weili of Taoist cultivators came from themselves, not to mention that he was the spirit of creation. No matter where he went, he had boundless Fa Li. In this situation, it could only be said that there was a higher power suppressing him. After thinking for a while, he did not pay much attention to it. He knew that this time, he was not the only one who sensed the opportunity. If it was suppressing, it must be that everyone who came in was troubled like this. However, as the reincarnation of the spirit of creation, when he encountered a great enemy that he could not match, even if he did not use the divine will to calculate, he could still obtain the answer from the heart realm, and then resolve the opponent's method. If he did not care about the price, he could even calculate the opponent's location in an instant. With this ability, he did not think that anyone in the same generation as him was a match for him. The only thing he had to avoid was being surrounded by many people, and that would be very troublesome to deal with. At this moment, his eyes moved, and he turned to look in a direction. He saw that there was an indistinct figure there, and he could feel that the other party's aura was deep and serene. It looked like a shadow, neither monster, neither human nor demon. His mind changed, and he thought of a possibility, and he said, could it be the legendary extraterrestrial demon? It seems that this time, it is not only the people of human Tao who came here to search for the opportunity, but also these abnormal demonic creatures. However, for something like Zhou Huanyu and Jade, it was already not bad to have one fated with him, and it was naturally impossible for there to be two. Therefore, no matter where this person came from, in his eyes, he was already an opponent. Since he had appeared in front of him, he might as well get rid of him. After seeing Yao Kanbei, the extraterrestrial demon did not avoid him, and he also came up to him silently. Obviously, he had the same idea as Yao Kanbei. At this moment, Yao Canbei's eyes narrowed slightly, and a strange spiritual light flowed in his eyes. At this moment, he had already dragged the extraterrestrial demon's mind into his body and mind world. He did not hope to use this to defeat the enemy, and only wanted to see if he could use this method to shake the other party's Tao intent. The heavenly demon's vital energy merely shook slightly, and then he seemed to not be affected in the slightest. A large expanse of black tide that was like smoke and water suddenly soared up behind him, and it blotted out the sky and the sun as it surged madly towards him. Yao Kanbei was slightly shocked. In this place, everyone's magic power was suppressed to the extreme, and the other party could actually release such power. However, with a calculation in his God's will, he understood that the extraterrestrial demon's method was actually turning the false into the real. If you see it as real, then the real will become real. Therefore, if his will was slightly shaken, then everything that he saw would no longer be an illusion. He laughed coldly, and did not use any powerful divine art. He only stretched out his hand and pushed lightly, and the rolling black tide in front of him disappeared into nothingness. Seeing that this method was not effective, the extraterrestrial demon's body became faint, and it slowly disappeared. Yao Canbei's face instantly revealed a strange expression. This extraterrestrial demon actually used a method to enter the depths of his soul, and wanted to compete with him on this level. In his eyes, this was a path to his own death. He closed his eyes, and after standing silently for a moment, the violent aura on his body calmed down. Then, after determining the direction, he flung his sleeves and searched for the place where the primordial stone might be. Chapter 2240. Although Yao Canbei eliminated the extraterrestrial demon, he had a feeling that although this demon lost in the mental battle, it didn't really die. Instead, it was lurking in the deepest part, waiting for a chance to launch a counterattack. He tried to deny this thought, but he couldn't truly be at ease. At this moment, he truly realized the strangeness of the extraterrestrial demon. After all, this kind of demon was also born from Bu Su Tian's against the world. It naturally couldn't be compared to the real spirit of creation. However, he was only a broken spirit of creation. As long as he hadn't reached the upper realm, then the difference between the two wasn't that big. He sorted out his mind and quickly suppressed this matter. To be honest, this wasn't a big deal to him. Although his cultivation was perfect, there was still room for polishing his Tao. If there was any problem, as long as he studied Tao again, it wouldn't be difficult to eliminate the hidden danger. At this moment, even he didn't realize that as he gradually relied on Tao itself, he no longer resisted like he did in the beginning. Later on, when he encountered difficulties, he wouldn't think of solving it himself, but would rely on Tao. He followed his senses, but that opportunity always seemed to be extremely far away. He couldn't get close no matter what. At this moment, he also felt the benefits of having his magic power suppressed. Even if he couldn't use any destructive methods here, the consumption of his magic power had become very small. Now, the consumption of his magic power could not even keep up with the recovery of his own breath. Of course, this was still a loss of vitality, but it was negligible. Even if he walked here for tens of thousands of years, he didn't need to refine the clear spirit qi. As he walked, he seemed to feel something. He looked up and saw an expressionless cultivator walking over from the front. Even though the person saw him, he didn't show any strange expression. Even when he walked, he didn't slow down at all. Seeing that he was a human cultivator, Yao Canbei thought for a while and went forward to greet him. He said, "May I know your name? Where do you cultivate?" The cultivator looked at him and answered simply, "Heartless Tao, Kuai He." Heartless Tao. Yao Canbei's understanding of the emotionless Tao was limited, but he roughly knew that such cultivators severed their emotions and extinguished their nature. Other than their own Tao, everything else was an external Tao. Their Tao intent was firm to the extreme. To deal with such a person, it was impossible to find a flaw in their mind. The only way to deal with them was to fight them head-on. Therefore, this was the type of person he hated the most. Kuai He did not seem to have any intention of fighting with him. As soon as he finished speaking, he walked past him. Yao Canbei looked at the direction he was heading in, which was completely opposite to his own. He was deep in thought. Perhaps everyone sensed that the opportunity was in a different place, or perhaps the whaley who had led them here wanted them to compete with each other. He glanced in a certain direction. Although he could not see a figure there, there was a weak aura floating, very similar to the extraterrestrial demon he saw before. It seemed that Kuai He had also discovered the existence of the heavenly demon and was afraid of being taken advantage of by this fellow, so he did not fight with him. He snorted coldly. These heavenly demons were very strange. If he encountered them alone, he might attack them. However, now was not the right time, so he also stepped away. After a while, a shadow appeared in the distance, staring at the direction Yao Canbei left with a fearful gaze. This time, the 6 great demon masters each sent a disciple to enter this place. However, after arriving here, they could no longer communicate with each other above the divine will. Heavenly demons were different from human cultivators. Everyone's aura could be entrusted to each other. Therefore, as long as one person made it out alive, as long as he brought his aura to the anti-heaven and earth to nourish it, he could return it. However, he clearly felt that a fellow cultivator had already fallen in Yaosanbei's hands. Moreover, the aura that was entrusted to him was actually dissipating. This undoubtedly meant that the other party had a way to completely end them. If he encountered this person again, he had to be extra careful. Even if he wanted to fight, it was best to contact other cultivators first before taking action. After taking another deep look at Yao Kanbei, his figure blurred and disappeared. Yao Kanbei followed the fortuitous opportunity to search. After an unknown amount of time, he finally arrived at the place where he sensed. He raised his head and saw that in front of him was a crystal mountain that was completely clear. It was tens of thousands of feet tall, and at the very top, there was a profound stone floating quietly. For cultivators, this was almost easily obtainable. He used the mountain to soar up and quickly reached the peak. Just as he was about to reach out to take it, his movements paused. Turning his head, he saw a cultivator with two swords on his back standing there quietly. He did not know when he had arrived. Nearby, there was another aura lingering around. It was another otherworldly demon. Yao Kanbei slowly retracted his hand. He cupped his hands and said, "I am Yao Zhan. May I know how I should address you, fellow Taoist?" The Taoist said, "Hong Yu." Yao Kanbei glanced at where the heavenly demon was and said, "Fellow Taoist, you and I are both human path cultivators. Why don't we work together to eliminate this demon first, then we can decide who this profound stone belongs to." Hong Yu said calmly, "That's feasible." When the heavenly demon heard this, he immediately turned into a shadow and quickly fled. Although he couldn't fly or teleport here, his speed of retreat wasn't slow. Hong Yu and Yao Kanbei stood where they were. Neither of them chased after him. Yao Kanbei glanced at him and said with a smile, "I heard that the divine item has an owner, and the one who is fated will obtain it. Why don't I try first?" Hong Yu didn't object and said, "Then please go ahead." Yao Kanbei was a little surprised by Hong Yu's attitude. He looked at the profound stone and pondered. Could it be that there was something wrong with it? But on second thought, if that was really the case, there was no need for that person to appear here and let him take it away just now. So he made up his mind and reached out to take it. However, when the item was in his hand just now, before he could be happy, it suddenly turned into a shadow. In a daze, he found that it had appeared in its original place again. He couldn't help but be stunned. Seeing this, Hong Yu turned around and left. Yao Kanbei was slightly surprised and asked loudly, "Is fellow Taoist not going to take this item? Perhaps this item is fated with fellow Taoist?" Hong Yu said, "Although this item is here, the law of fate hasn't landed on me yet. Although it's close at hand, it's actually far away. Whether I take it or not, it's the same." Yao Kanbei was deep in thought. At this time, he seemed to notice something and suddenly turned around to look, only to see that it was actually empty behind him. The profound stone had disappeared at some point. At the same time, that sense of fate actually appeared in an extremely distant place. He frowned. Perhaps it was as Hong Yu said, the fate hadn't truly landed yet. He once heard that in the past, when the heaven origin jade entered the world, it needed the guidance of a fated person. However, the fated person might not be the owner of fate. In the end, there was only one true owner of fate. Although there were many people fighting for the heaven origin jade this time, if only one person survived in the end, then even if he wasn't the owner of fate, he would still be the owner of fate. When he thought up to here, he couldn't help but shoot his gaze at Hong Yu again, and a trace of a cold light suffused the depths of his eyes. Hong Yu hadn't gone far when he felt the killing intent behind him. His footsteps suddenly stopped and he silently turned around. Yaosanbei's thoughts moved, and he immediately dragged Hong Yu into his mind realm. However, Hong Yu didn't react at all, and even his aura didn't fluctuate in the slightest. His eyes flickered. As expected, those that were able to enter this place were all people with firm wills and Tao insights, and they wouldn't be so easily affected by his Tao art. Hong Yu instead formed a sword seal, and a sword cry resounded from behind him as a sword instantly flew out. At this moment, Yao Canbei's expression suddenly changed, yet he didn't receive it at all. Instead, he circulated all his Fa Li and fled extremely swiftly towards the distance. When he arrived in the distance, he saw that Hong Yu didn't pursue him, and only then did he heave a sigh of relief in his heart, yet his eyes revealed a fearless expression. Just now, when Hong Yu's sword slashed over, he felt an enormous threat, and he immediately entered his mind realm to deduce a method to deal with it. However, he noticed later on that Hong Yu's sword technique revolved according to the enemy's aura, and it was changing at every moment, and every change could extend into boundless techniques. When one's sword technique was cultivated to this stage, it could be said that it had been developed to the extreme. If he used his own divine decree, he might not be able to find any flaws even after exhausting himself. Thus, he couldn't receive this sword at all. The only choice he could make was to disregard his defense and directly take out the root fruit to attack his opponent, and see who could take down the opponent first. It was just that he instinctively felt that he absolutely couldn't let his opponent hit him even once, or else he might not have a chance to retaliate. If this was the final battle for the profound stone, and only the two of them were left, then he might have to risk being assimilated by the Tao art to fight to the death. However, it wasn't that time yet, so it wasn't worth it at all. He secretly thought in his heart, this person is so impressive. I'm afraid he's the biggest obstacle in obtaining the origin jade this time. I need to properly think about how to deal with this person. He walked alone on the land. His eyes were like a pool of stagnant water, and his expression was abnormally indifferent. On the way, he had encountered the extraterrestrial demon twice. The other party had expressed goodwill to him and invited him to work together, but he didn't have the intention to join forces with them. Although the Heartless Path and the extraterrestrial demon were allies in name, the two parties were only united to fight against a great enemy. There was no friendship to speak of. This time, at most, only one person could obtain the origin jade, so in reality, he was also an opponent with this generation. Moreover, Deng Zhang had warned him long ago that the mana that attracted them here was extraordinary. Even that person couldn't deduce anything, so if he lost his life here, he wouldn't be able to figure out who did it, and he shouldn't expect anyone to stand up for him. After walking for an unknown amount of time, he finally walked to the place where the opportunity was the strongest. At this moment, his gaze focused, and he saw a mound in front of him. A Taoist was standing there with his hands behind his back, and a profound stone was quietly floating on top of the mound. However, for some reason, that person didn't reach out to take it. He silently sensed for a moment, and could confirm that there was no one of his generation around. Since that was the case, he might as well get rid of that person first. Regardless of whether he could really obtain the profound stone, at least he would have one less opponent. Having made up his mind, he took a step forward. His eyes flashed, and a white light shot out from his eyes, heading straight for the Taoist's back. Chapter 2241. The white light in Kuai He's eyes shot out just now. Originally, it was aimed at the opponent's back. However, the opponent gently waved his sleeves. The rainbow of light suddenly changed direction and landed on an empty space at the side, creating a bottomless pit in the ground. There was a different universe in this world. Everyone's mana and chi were suppressed. Some of the supernatural Taoist techniques that should have the power to destroy the heaven and earth performed mediocre here. However, just now, although the supernatural power was just a test, it was easily blocked by the opponent. It was enough to show that the opponent was brilliant. He instantly raised the threat level of this Taoist. Perhaps this was a very troublesome opponent, much more brilliant than his previous judgment. However, since he decided to make a move, he would not feel regret. As a heartless Taoist, he did not have such emotions. He only had the choice of pros and cons. Moreover, at that moment just now, he displayed a supernatural power. He compared the opponent's mana with his own mana. The results showed that he had a higher chance of winning this battle. If there was an uncertain result or the opponent was stronger than him, then he might choose to escape immediately. However, since the chance of winning was with him, why should he retreat? He made a gesture in his heart. Something seemed to surge around him. There was originally nothing, but suddenly, there were many thunderbolt-like cracks. Wherever these cracks passed, everything that they touched would either break apart or disappear into thin air. However, the Taoist did not move at all. All the cracks seemed to avoid him. Not a single one swept past his body. He saw that his method was ineffective, but he did not show any surprise on his face. His movements did not stop because of this. The mana in his body churned and a vortex appeared above the two of them. It gradually expanded and pressed downwards. Then, it suddenly fell and swallowed the Taoist. After a long time, as the vortex disappeared, the Taoist's figure also disappeared. He sensed for a moment. There was no longer the existence of the Taoist's mana. His originally taut heartstrings relaxed a little. In order to deal with this person, he almost used his most powerful method. Fortunately, this exchange didn't take up too much time. Otherwise, if someone else were to intervene, they might be taken advantage of. He took a few steps forward and was about to take the profound stone, but at that moment, his footsteps suddenly stopped. He raised his head and looked up. He saw a paper talisman slowly float down from above and land at his feet. Then, it turned into a ray of light and dissipated. There was a trace of residual qi on it, and it was exactly the same as the Taoist just now. He was puzzled at first, and then he seemed to have thought of something and deduced. After a short moment, his pupils constricted abruptly as he instantly came to an understanding. Just now, the thing he was going against wasn't the real deal, and from the beginning until the end, it was only that talisman. The result that he had calculated with his divine ability was actually the victor between him and the talisman. A mere talisman was already so powerful. What if the owner of the talisman appeared here? At this moment, he suddenly sensed something and looked at the original location of the profound stone. He discovered that it was already empty, and in the distance, a vague feeling appeared again. He pondered for a long time, then turned around and left. He wasn't prepared to participate in this battle for the origin jade anymore, because as long as that Taoist was here, then he had no chance of winning. After Hong Yu defeated Yao Kanbei, he pursued that feeling. He saw that Zhou Huanyuan jade twice, but he could feel that the real fated chance hadn't descended yet. The other people who were fighting for the origin jade seemed to have the same feeling. Therefore, they only tested each other, but they discovered that both sides weren't easy to deal with. Without absolute confidence, no one entered the battle to the death. And after about the 9th appearance of the profound stone, a strong feeling arose in everyone's heart. This time, the fated chance wouldn't slip away. Whoever obtained the profound stone would be the fated master. Therefore, everyone followed this direction. When Hong Yu found his way over, he saw 5 extraterrestrial demons standing in the field, while Yao Kanbei stood alone at one side. His gaze directly leaped over this person and looked into the distance. At the very front, he saw a Taoist standing there with his hands behind his back facing everyone, and the profound stone was floating not far in front of him. At this moment, the 2 swords behind his back started buzzing and trembling. He took a breath, then said to Yao Kanbei and the 5 extraterrestrial demons in a low voice, "All of you, go away." That person was his opponent, and he didn't want anyone to disturb him when he was concentrating on the battle. Yao Kanbei glanced at him, his eyes flashing, but he didn't say anything and directly retreated to the side. The 5 extraterrestrial demons, however, stood there without moving at all. Seeing this, Hong Yu didn't say anything more. He raised his hand and took down the Yin sword on his back, then slowly drew the sword out of its scabbard. After that, he raised his finger and swiped it, and there was a flash of spiritual light above it. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the sword flew into the sky, then suddenly disappeared. At this moment, the 5 extraterrestrial demons felt that their essence, qi, and magic power were actually being continuously stripped away. Clearly, there was an invisible sword that was chopping at their qi, spirit, and soul. It was just that they couldn't find where it was at the moment. Their response was also very decisive. Two of them suddenly disappeared and suddenly leaped into Hong Yu's mind, attempting to use this to break his soul's state of mind. Meanwhile, the other three sped up their attacks, but they didn't go all out. Instead, they paid attention to the outside, guarding against Yao Kanbei and the Taoist who still hadn't turned around. Yao Canbei's gaze was fixed on the field, but he stood there without moving. Hong Yu was the greatest enemy in his heart, and the other 5 extraterrestrial demons seemed to be advancing and retreating together, so they weren't easy to deal with either. At this moment, it was better to just stand at the side and wait for an opportunity. This battle didn't last for long. Hong Yu fought 1 against 5. At the beginning, the battle was calm, but as time went on, he increasingly gained the upper hand. As long as the extraterrestrial demons' methods were exposed, they would definitely be countered. Even if they leaped into Hong Yu's mind, they would still be slashed out with a single strike. In the end, in order to salvage the situation, the 5 of them had no choice but to repeatedly use the root fruit. Anyone could tell that the situation had already become extremely dangerous. The light in Yao Canbei's eyes became dangerous. He knew that the opportunity he had been waiting for was about to arrive. Before long, Hong Yu's decisive strike finally landed, and those 5 extraterrestrial demons were continuously being sliced away by the sword qi. Seeing that their destruction was imminent, Yao Kanbei finally moved. However, Hong Yu seemed to be long prepared. He glanced at him and slashed out with a backhand. Yao Kanbei only felt an inexplicable sense of danger descend upon him. Knowing that he couldn't avoid it, he immediately took out the root fruit and activated his magic power, pressing down on Hong Yu's body. However, that sword light flashed, and with a rumble, it directly split his body apart. Only his head was left rolling in the air. Yao Canbei's consciousness hadn't completely disappeared, and there was a look of confusion in his eyes. He had clearly taken out the root fruit, so why was it like this? At this moment, a wave of understanding surged in him. It turned out that when he and Hong Yu first met face to face, he actually wasn't able to dodge that slash that came slashing over. Instead, it hid within his body and didn't release it, continuously searching for his original location. However, as long as he didn't appear in front of Hong Yu in the future, then there wouldn't be any danger. As time passed, the sword qi would naturally dissipate. However, if the 2 of them were to fight again in a short period of time, then once he took out the root fruit, the other would definitely be able to predict where he would land. Therefore, the danger he saw at that time actually didn't land at that time, but right before his eyes. However, it was already too late for him to know all this now. His head rolled a few more times in midair before it was sliced into pieces by a streak of sword qi that followed closely behind. After Hong Yu completely annihilated his remaining essence qi and the 5 extraterrestrial demons, he guided the sword seal, and the sword returned to its sheath. He raised his head and glanced at the Taoist. Just now, the Taoist didn't even turn back to look at him, as if all of this had nothing to do with him. He took a few steps forward and cupped his hands, saying, "Taoist Shen, long time no see." Shen Chong turned around and nodded, saying, "So it's Taoist Hong Yu, long time no see." Hong Yu's gaze focused on him, and he said, "Before entering this place, I originally thought that I was here for Zhou Huanyu and Jade, but only now do I know that my heart is still clinging to that defeat in the past, and I just can't let it go. Today, my wish can be fulfilled." Shen Chong glanced at him, and said, "You came too early. The current you is still not my opponent." Hong Yu's expression didn't change, and his heart was firm. If he was swayed by words, then there was no need for him to come here at all. He cupped his hands again, and said, "Please enlighten me, Taoist." Shen Chong didn't care, and he said, "Then as you wish." Hong Yu took a few steps back, and his expression was extremely solemn. Only he knew how powerful the person in front of him was, and this time, he had to go all out to have a chance of winning. He looked at Shen Chong's figure, and his chi will and mana instantly climbed to the peak. The clanging of swords came from his back, and it was the first time that he used both swords at the same time. At this moment, Shen Chong raised his head, and glanced at him. At the same time, a divine will was sent over. Hong Yu stood there for a long time, and with a thought, the two swords returned to their scabbards, and he sighed, I lost. Shen Chong didn't really fight with him, but after he raised his swords, he showed him the deduction of the divine will, and the result was that after one round, he suffered a great loss. He could tell that this was the most realistic deduction, and not an illusion. In the past, he could still see some traces of Shen Chong's technique, but now, he couldn't even tell what method Shen Chong used to defeat him. He couldn't help but ask, what method is this? Shen Chong didn't hide anything, and said casually, it's just a perfect fusion. Perfect fusion, Hong Yu muttered it twice, and he already understood what it meant. The so-called perfect fusion was to combine all the divine abilities, Tao techniques, and even Dharma approaches into one place. Not only that, but the technique itself had already transcended all of these and reached a whole new level. This was equivalent to using a perfect technique of a higher level to attack a flawed technique of a lower level. Moreover, everything that the user knew was included in the technique. If the other party could break through this point, it would be equivalent to breaking through his everything. Therefore, as long as there were shortcomings and flaws in his own cultivation, he wouldn't be able to block this move, no matter how many times it came. He was very clear that although his sword technique was well practiced and had almost no flaws, his other techniques were still lacking. However, when it came to a real battle, he could use his strengths to make up for it, and in reality, most people in the world couldn't achieve perfection. However, Shen Chong's method was clearly a step further than perfection. Their understanding of the Tao was already on a completely different level. No wonder Shen Chong said that he came early, because in his view, he still had many areas that could be polished. After a moment of silence, he raised his hand and bowed, saying slowly, thank you. As soon as he finished speaking, he immediately moved. However, he hadn't gone far when he heard Shen Chong's voice behind him. Fellow Taoist, there's no need to take this battle too seriously. The battle before us isn't the final battle, and the victory before us isn't the final victory. Hong Yu's footsteps paused slightly, and then he continued walking, leaving without looking back. Chapter 2242. After Hong Yu left, Shen Chong looked at the sky. Following everyone's defeat, this piece of heaven and earth became lively again. This meant that the power that shrouded this place was disappearing. He did not understand what this power was. He could not see it nor sense it. He only knew that it existed. For example, the supernatural power that suppressed all the cultivators here, causing the vital essence to dissipate quickly after everyone's Dharmakaya was destroyed. This should be the power of this power. Based on his own knowledge, he simply attributed it to some kind of obsession. This obsession repeatedly created opportunities for him to take the Zhou Huanyuan jade, but he rejected it again and again. In this process, it was obvious that the restriction of the obsession on the primordial jade was slowly disappearing. He did not think that this was his own effort. He felt that it was very likely that this obsession could not achieve its wish and was becoming weaker under the corrosion of some kind of equivalent power. He looked at the primordial jade. When the Weili's influence completely disappeared, then it was time to take the item. He could accept the primordial jade, but he would never accept the primordial jade given by others. This action was equivalent to him competing with this power on a different level. Of course, this did not eliminate the possibility that the other party did this intentionally. He might have been within the other party's calculations from the beginning. Even so, it was due to the difference in levels and it was not unacceptable. Just like what he said earlier, the victory before him was not the final victory. The battle before him was also not the final battle. As long as he could live up to his Taoist heart, it was fine. After Kuai he backed out of the battle, he found a place to sit down quietly. He was betting that after he gave up the primordial jade, he could leave this place. However, if there was only one person left here, the primordial jade would only appear. That was fate. After waiting for an unknown period of time, he suddenly felt something. He realized that his suppressed power was rapidly recovering. He could not help but stand up. Once this power returned, he would undoubtedly be able to break through the void and leave. He did not need to stay here anymore. He did not pursue the reason here. Without hesitation, he leaped into the clouds. In an instant, the sky broke and he had already crashed out of this place. This time, the forces from Heartless Tao, extraterrestrial demons, and Khanate demons were all annihilated. In the end, he was the only one who managed to escape. If it wasn't for the fact that he knew that he couldn't compete with his opponents and withdrew from the battle for the Essence Jade in advance, he would probably have the same ending. In the land of creation, Xiang Ju and the others also sensed something at this moment. They realized that there was no one to rely on when they were sent to the Weili. They immediately knew that the chess piece had made a mistake. Heng Wu said, "Looks like fellow Taoist's plan has failed." Wei Ming said in a deep voice, "Fellow Taoist is wrong. This is not fellow Taoist Xiangjue's scheme alone. If we want to talk about failure, it is our plan that has failed." Xiang Ju appeared to be very relaxed and was not disappointed at all. He smiled and said, "It doesn't matter if it doesn't work. It is just an idle chess piece. There is no need to be too calculative. Moreover, the reincarnation of the spirit of creation was defeated by others. It is enough to show that it is only a so-so. It is not impossible to defeat." Wei Ming nodded and said, "Even though it's only a fragment of the spirit of creation, it doesn't mean that it's not that formidable without its mighty strength. If we're able to divide and annihilate its mighty strength, we might indeed be able to annihilate it." Ji Zhuang did not say anything. Although he did not like Fengdu, what Wei Ming said was undoubtedly correct. It was meaningless to divide one's energy on these minor details. It was better to think about how to deal with the spirit of creation. At this moment, Hengdu glanced below the stage and sneered. He had actually seen all the little tricks of this generation. At the very least, the Weili could not be hidden from him. However, this matter was too small. As long as it did not interfere with official business, he could not be bothered to care. On one of the mountain peaks in the outer sea of the mountain and sea realm, a beam of light flickered as a realm gate opened up. Hong Yozhong emerged, and after some quick calculations, he realized that only a few moments had passed since he had left. He looked around. Although he had failed this time and did not obtain any origin jade, it was not as if he did not gain anything. He had originally thought that having reached this stage of cultivation, he had almost reached the end of the realm. However, he had seen a whole different world from Shinchong. However, if he simply relied on himself to cultivate in seclusion, he would not make much progress. One could imagine how many outstanding talents there were in the heavens and the 10,000 realms. He should not be limited to a corner. He should also go around visiting famous and powerful people, honing his Taoist skills and searching for opportunities. As for his first stop, there was no doubt that he would first visit the Shaoqing sect and the Qinsang sect. These two sects were undoubtedly the best of the best in terms of Taoist teachings in the mountain and sea realm. Back when the cultivators of these two sects had broken through the barriers of heaven and earth, they had led all the sects of the 9 continents to ascend to the outer realm. Although he had interacted with the cultivators of these two sects, he had never paid them a formal visit. Now was the perfect time to fulfill that wish. Although the primal Yang sect had been destroyed in the mortal tribulation, he did not feel any resentment. If he had been in their shoes, he would have made the same choice to break through to the outer realm. He would not have allied himself with those people who would defend their own land to the death. Furthermore, after ascending, he was no longer a person of the primal Yang sect. Therefore, he had nothing to worry about. After getting his bearings, he used a divine ability to teleport in the direction of the Western Sky Badlands, the Kunshi continent. After escaping from Yaocan Bay, Duan Qing immediately returned to the branch altar. The first thing he wanted to do was to interrogate He Fang. Even if he had no evidence, he could not allow He Fang to take over the position of Chief Dharma Protector before everything was clear. However, after investigating, he found that He Fang had already found an excuse to leave, and was now nowhere to be found. Furious, Duan Qing immediately went to the inner temple to interrogate Elder Yuan. Elder Yuan was very calm, and replied, "This matter is not clear yet, so we can't jump to conclusions. I will send a letter to He Fang and ask him to return. However, just now, Dharma Protector Duan went to capture the good fortune spirit, and did not notify me. He almost lost his life. I will report this matter to the main altar later. Duanqing angrily said, I will apologize to the main altar for this matter, but we cannot tolerate traitors. Furthermore, what happened to He Fang was clearly your doing. You cannot absolve yourself from the blame. Elder Yuan expressionlessly said, Please leave, Dharma Protector Duan. I will deal with this matter myself, and I will give the branch altar a satisfactory explanation. Duanqing said, Fine, I'll see how you deal with this. He waved his sleeve and left angrily. Elder Yuan's face darkened. He never thought that He Fang would do something like this. Just now, when he said that he would send a letter to He Fang to return, he was just saying it casually. Based on his experience, it was not difficult for him to determine that He Fang's sudden improvement in cultivation was most likely due to the Tao technique of the good fortune spirit. He sighed. This time, he had made a mistake, and it was his fault for trusting people too easily. However, since he had already made a mistake, he could not make a second one. Before he left, he must find a way to solve this matter. He summoned the deacons in the branch altar, and said, Pass my order to the Dharma protectors. Whoever captures He Fang, I will recommend that person to be the next great Dharma protector. The deacons said, Elder, He Fang is very powerful. I'm afraid those Dharma protectors are no match for him. Elder Yuan Daoren said, It's fine. They can borrow the transcendent artifacts in the branch altar, and I didn't say that they would fight him alone. The deacons said, Elder, forgive me for speaking bluntly. From all the signs, it is very likely that those dozens of sects have been bewitched by the good fortune spirit. If we ignore this, there will be many troubles in the future. Elder Yuan shook his head and said, I have thought of all that you said. However, even if there is something wrong with those sects, it is not appropriate for us to act now. You must know that I have never been on good terms with those sections. If I were to do this again, even if I have a good reason to do so, these people will be even more hostile towards me. Instead of that, we might as well just ignore it. When they can't handle it, it won't be too late for us to step in. The deacons wanted to say something but stopped. If they ignored this matter now, it would definitely cause endless harm. However, what Elder Yuan said made sense, and he could understand. Right now, Yan Jiao had a pile of problems that he had yet to solve, so how could he be in the mood to care about this? At this time, Elder Yuan said with a solemn expression, There is one more thing. The matter of He Fang must not be spread out. Tell the protectors that no one is allowed to leak this matter. He believed that regardless of whether this matter was right or wrong, it must not be blown out of proportion. It must not be made known to everyone. Otherwise, if everyone in the branch altar knew that a person who was about to become the chief protector had long been in cahoots with the good fortune spirit, the people would definitely be shaken. The deacons nodded and said, I understand. He bowed and retreated. Elder Yuan sighed and sat behind the table for a while. Then, he picked up a brush and wrote down the general situation. Then, he sealed the letter. He summoned a trusted aide and said, Go to the main altar through the realm gate. You need to personally hand this item to Elder Gao. The aide said solemnly, Don't worry, Master. I will not disappoint you. Elder Yuan knew that even if Gao Guo was willing to put in a good word for him, it would be difficult for him to escape the blame. A good fortune spirit had been hiding under his nose for a long time. Even the next chief protector was in trouble. If things were to get worse, the branch altar might be in danger of being destroyed. After sending the letter, he suddenly thought of something. He knocked on the table and suddenly looked up. He said to the servant outside, Go and find Protector Meng. The servant received the order and left. After waiting for a long time, the servant finally came back and reported, Master, when I found him, I said that Protector Meng happened to be out on a pilgrimage. Fortunately, I heard that Protector Meng has. Elder Yuan could not bear to listen to him. He waved his hand and interrupted him. He asked directly, Where is he now? The servant lowered his head and said, Well, Protector Meng's real body is not here. He said that he went to a sect to visit Tao. However, I found his mana clone. It is now waiting outside the door. Elder Yuan frowned and said, "Mana clone?" He thought about it. Even if it was a mana clone, the real body would know what he was told. It was a pity that this person had not cultivated to the level of mortal metamorphosis. Otherwise, with the divine will, everything could be explained clearly. He said in a deep voice, "Call him in." After a short while, Meng Hu's transcendence energy doppelganger walked in. He bowed to Elder Yuan and said proudly, "Greetings, Elder Yuan. I am Meng Hu's doppelganger." Elder Yuan's eyelids twitched. It was the first time he saw such a high-spirited clone. This made him feel inexplicably uncomfortable. However, now was not the time to care about this. He took a deep breath and sternly said, "Protector Meng, I believe you know about He Fang. He has probably obtained the Tao art of the spirit of creation. You've enlightened the spirit of creation several times before, so you should be more familiar with him than the other protectors. I need you to immediately put down what you're doing and go capture him." Chapter 2243. After Meng Hu's clone heard this, he immediately patted his chest and said, "Elder Yuan, don't worry. In such a dangerous moment, I will naturally stand up. Moreover, I am the best at purifying the spirit of creation. Elder Yuan has found the right person." Elder Yuan was relieved. In critical moments, Meng Hu was still quite reliable. Although it was still hard to predict the outcome, at least he was brave enough to do things. However, he was also afraid that this person was too confident, so he solemnly reminded, "The spirit of creation has only been born in this world for a few short years, yet his Fa Li has already risen to an extremely high level. He has just obtained the spirit of creation, and his Fa Li has also improved. Although it is still not comparable to the spirit of creation, it is difficult to know what level he has reached. You should still be careful. You can take a few arcane treasures from the treasury to protect yourself." He called a supervising disciple over and said, "Later, bring Guardian Meng to the vault to choose a few treasures." Meng Hu's clone said loudly, "Elder Yuan, just wait for my good news." Elder Yuan seemed to have thought of something and stopped him, "Wait." Meng Hu's clone said, "Elder, do you have any other orders?" Elder Yuan stared at him and said, "Are you going to go by yourself?" Meng Hu's clone said with a face full of righteousness, "Elder, how dare I?" Elder Yuan frowned and said, "What I mean is for you to pass the message to the original, not for you to go." Meng Hu's clone was very displeased and said, "Elder Yuan, although I am Meng Hu's clone, I also know what Meng Hu knows. Elder, are you looking down on me?" Elder Yuan felt a bit of a headache, but he was too lazy to argue with a clone. He waved his hand and said, "Then we'll do as you say. You can leave first." The supervising disciple stepped forward and said, "Guardian Meng, please, I will bring you to the vault to get a suitable treasure." Meng Hu's clone was excited again. He bowed and followed the supervising disciple out. The servant saw him leave and moved closer to Elder Yuan and said, "Master, Guardian Meng is only using his clone to deal with Guardian He. Isn't this a joke?" Elder Yuan shook his head and said, "Don't worry about it. If his clone is lost, will the original ignore it? This can be considered to have achieved our goal." But when he spoke up to this point, he suddenly came back to his senses and asked with a frown, "Right, I haven't asked why Meng Hu left a clone here. Where did he go?" The attendant replied, "I heard that Guardian Meng went to pacify the sects that were corrupted by the creation spirit Tao technique." Elder Yuan's expression changed, and he said, "Nonsense. How could he interfere in such a matter at this time? I don't recall ever asking for him. Use the branch altar's edict to summon him back immediately." The attendant said awkwardly, "But Protector Meng went with Protector Duan." "What?" Elder Yuan immediately became irritated. As the head protector, Duan Qing did not need to report to him unless the subalter was facing a powerful enemy. Furthermore, Duan Cheng's authority over the protector was even greater than his own, so there was nothing he could do to stop Duan Cheng. But in this way, Yan Jiao will certainly be pushed to the heart of the struggle. His original plan of sitting and not moving will come to nothing. He said angrily, "It's all nonsense. All of them act on impulse and don't know how to look at the big picture. Meng Hu's clone walked out of the inner chamber and asked the supervising disciple who led the way in front, "Right, do you know who that He Fang is?" The supervising disciple was taken aback and looked at Meng Hu strangely, and cautiously reminded him, "Protector Meng, He Fang is Protector He." Meng Hu's clone hummed and asked suspiciously, "Is there such a person?" The supervising disciple was stunned, and then he thought that the person in front of him was just a clone, and some memories that the original thought were unimportant might not have been given. With this thought, he felt relieved, and so he pointed with a finger, and a wisp of smoke turned into a human shape, revealing He Fang's square-shaped figure. He said, "This is Protector He." Meng Hu's clone was surprised, "Isn't this Protector Yang?" The supervising disciple hurriedly said, "This person is He Fang, Protector Meng mustn't get the wrong person." However, he had heard of this person's way of doing things in the past, so he was still a little worried, and said, "Protector Meng, please wait a moment." He turned around and went inside. After a while, he came out and handed a wooden talisman. "This has the chi dynamic left by Protector He. Although he will definitely try to cover it, it may be useful to Protector Meng." Meng Hu's clone seemed to have thought of something, and said with interest, "There is such a thing, I want it." The supervising disciple was slightly relieved, and said, "Protector Meng, there may be other protectors coming to take the treasures today, why don't you go earlier, lest all the good things are taken away?" At this moment, He Fang was fleeing to the depths of the Kunshe continent, where there was an escape route that he had prepared a few years ago. After discovering that Duan Cheng had successfully escaped from Yaoken Bay, he knew that he could no longer stay in the branch altar, because the first thing that Duan Cheng would do when he returned would probably be to capture him. However, he was not ready to leave the Kunshe continent yet. The cultivation of the spirit of creation Dao technique was not like the teaching Dao technique, which also needed to operate spiritual opportunity. Moreover, the continent had limitless spiritual opportunity, and there was an inexhaustible supply of foreign objects. There was no place like this. The most important thing was that the teaching Dao faced a lot of pressure here, and it was impossible for all the upper echelons to come out to capture him, so he could still be free and unfettered for a period of time. Moreover, with his cultivation, if he discovered that something was wrong, he could escape from the heaven realm at any time. Not long after, he came to a concealed mound. As soon as his figure landed, the restriction turned, and he sank down into a cave. He sat cross-legged and isolated his chi dynamic. At the same time, he waved his sleeve, and a spiritual light flew out. This was to go to the sects that submitted to the spirit of creation Dao technique, and inform them that they had already been exposed. The teaching Dao's next step was likely to be to suppress them, so they could only join forces to fight against the teaching Dao. Once the two met, they could share his attention, and then whether they would leave or stay depended on the specific situation. At the headquarters of the teaching Dao, Gao Qingtu had already received Duan Cheng's report. After reading it, he was very displeased. The stone tablet had given several edicts related to the spirit of creation, so he had always attached great importance to this matter. Moreover, its threat to the teaching Dao was far greater than that of the Luo sect and the Virtue sect, so the teaching Dao had always been annihilated as soon as it was discovered. However, he did not expect that the branch altar of the Kunshe continent would make such a mistake this time. It actually allowed a person who was bewitched by the spirit of creation Dao technique to almost become the great protector. He immediately called Gao Guo over, threw the report in front of him, and said, "This Yuan Hepei, how did he make things like this?" Before Gao Guo came here, he also received Elder Yuan's report. He picked it up and looked at it. Seeing that the description was more or less the same, he said, "Teacher, this disciple has also heard of this matter. This is all disciples' fault for not recognizing people well." Gao Qingtu said in a deep voice, "There is no need for you to take responsibility for this matter. Yuan Peihe used to follow me in the early years. I originally thought that it was safe to do things, but I didn't expect it to cause so much trouble." In reality, when the branch altar was first established, there were too few people who could truly reach the upper realm of the teaching Dao. Moreover, the Kunshe continent must have a mighty person to keep watch, so they could only let those with high cultivation take the place first. Their ability was instead secondary. However, now that several hundred years had passed, there were a few more outstanding people taking the place, so it was not as embarrassing as before. Gao Guo said, "Should I call Elder Yuan back?" Gao Qingtu waved his hand and said, "No, let him continue to stay there. The current situation of the branch altar cannot be chaotic. You personally make a trip to the Kunshe continent, but don't make a big fuss. Stabilize the situation for me, and it will be fine as long as it doesn't become chaotic. Also, the spirit of creation must be eradicated. If necessary, you can personally take action." Gao Guo said, "Yes, this disciple will make some preparations and then leave." He sighed in his heart. When the matter was over, Elder Yuan could only return to serve as a guardian elder without any authority. In the future, he would probably not be able to hold a post outside. After returning to the sect, he arranged all the matters in his hands properly. On the second day, he was ready to leave. However, just now, when he left the mansion, he saw Zhang Chan standing there. He said in surprise, "Master Zhang, why are you here?" Zhang Chan said, "This time, I have also stayed in the main altar for quite some time, so I can just go to the Kunshe continent to visit a few old friends and take a look at that disappointing disciple of mine." After casually taking a few magic treasures, Meng Hu's clone left the branch altar and headed towards the depths of the wasteland. Although he was also a spirit of creation, he was not someone who had been taught by him, so he could not sense it. However, he had another way. He stopped on a barren mountain and took out a jade box from his sleeve. After opening it, there was a golden smoke rising. This smoke rose higher and higher, and soon, there was the momentum of a mountain, and there was a buzzing sound. This golden smoke was formed by the gathering of thin-winged golden worms the size of rice grains. He flipped his palm again and took out the talisman that had Yifang's chi dynamic. The golden worms circled around the talisman, and with a bang, like a thunder, they flew in all directions. These golden worms were bestowed by Zhang Chan, and they were best at tracking the enemy. What was more amazing was that as long as there was spiritual opportunity, they could continue to multiply, and even increase in number. If it was in an ordinary world, then they could quickly invade a world, but in the Kunshe continent, this would not happen, because there were too many strange monsters that fed on the worms, so there was no chance for them to grow. However, after a few days, Meng Hu's clone noticed that the golden worms were moving in one direction, and finally hovering near a barren mountain. He was excited, and with a flash of conveyance light, he moved towards that direction. In the cave, Yifang suddenly opened his eyes and looked outside. He saw that there were countless worms lingering on the place where he was hiding. They were obviously domesticated by someone, and he could not help but be shocked, afraid that it was Duan Cheng or Elder Yuan who came looking for him personally. However, after a while, he saw a figure appear above him. He was startled at first, and then after a brief inspection, he found that there was only one person. He could not help but smile angrily, and said, "Meng Hu, even you dare to bully me? I was originally looking for you, but I did not expect that you would come to me yourself. Then, don't blame me for not being polite." He released his chi dynamic and came out from his hiding place. Chapter 2244. The moment Yifang came out, he felt that something was amiss. He took a closer look and realized that Meng Hu was only a clone, but for some reason, he was unable to distinguish it just now. There was no meaning in destroying a clone, and if the real body sensed the changes here, it would expose his whereabouts. He snorted. He did not want to leave this place yet, and to avoid such consequences, it seemed like he could only reveal his Dao technique to the other person. Although the other person was here as a clone, their minds were still connected. As long as the Dao consciousness was shaken and submitted to his Dao technique, then it would not be a problem. Meng Hu's clone saw that Yifang came out and said righteously, "Yifang, you betrayed the sect and joined the heretic path. Elder Yuan specially ordered me to come and capture you." Yifang laughed in anger. "What is a clone like you acting all high and mighty in front of me?" In order to subdue the other person, he could not be bothered to be calculative at this moment. With a turn of his mind, all the mana in his body spread out, and instantly enveloped the heaven and earth within 100 miles. The sun, moon, and sky were all covered, and the surroundings immediately fell into darkness. At the same time, he heard the sound of celestial music, and then there were countless Tao techniques appearing on the great curtain of heaven and earth. He was not like Yao Kanbei, who had the ability to pull people into the heart realm, and could only rely on the Tao technique incarnation to explain all the principles, so he could only use a similar method to transmit his Tao technique. However, he was slightly worried at this moment. To be honest, he could not really see through Meng Hu, and could not figure out what he was thinking. But according to normal judgment, Meng Hu's cultivation was not weak, so he must be pursuing the Tao technique. In that case, he had a great chance, because the Tao technique of the creation spirit could exactly satisfy the desire of such a person. After Meng Hu's clone saw this level of Tao technique, he looked up and seemed to be attracted. He Yifang was overjoyed. Although he did not like Meng Hu, if he could subdue this person silently, it would be very beneficial for him to do things in the future. Meng Hu's clone was a little confused. Why did you show me this? But it seems to be a little different. He pondered for a moment and said, I've seen your Tao technique. I won't let you suffer. When Yifang heard this, he had a bad feeling that something was off. However, before he could react, he felt his mind sink. When he looked up again, he found that he had entered a void. It was a very familiar situation, and when he realized what was happening, an expression of disbelief appeared on his face. This Meng Hu was actually a spirit of creation. At this moment, as if sensing something, he turned his head and saw a Taoist walking out from the darkness. The Taoist bowed to him and said with a mysterious expression, Have you heard of the spirit of creation? After knowing the other party's identity, Yifang didn't dare to act rashly. He bowed and said cautiously, I was fortunate enough to have listened to the profoundness of the Tao, and now I have entered the Tao. The Taoist shook his head and said, No, that's not right. What you're learning is to follow the Tao, not to obtain it. Yifang was startled and asked unconsciously, What does it mean to follow the Tao? What does it mean to attain the Tao? The Taoist chuckled and immediately recited a Tao technique. By right, Meng Hu and Yao Kanbei were both fragments of the spirit of creation, so their Tao techniques should be the same. However, in reality, after they were reincarnated and possessed their own will, they also had a side to them that was born as a human, and there was a distinction of primary and secondary. Meng Hu himself had been fighting with this Tao technique all along. If Yao Canbei's Tao technique was said to have the absolute upper hand, then he was said to have a slight advantage over Yao Canbei's Tao technique. In this way, the Tao technique would slowly change to the side that he wanted to see. If he continued to maintain it without wavering, then the Tao technique would completely transform into his own. It would become a ladder for him to ascend the Tao, and not a puppet of the Tao technique. After Yifang heard the Tao technique, he couldn't help but feel dazed, and at the same time, a hint of confusion appeared on his face. There was no need to submit to the Tao technique at all, but to subdue it and make it his own to use. He was no longer the servant of the Tao technique, but the master of the Tao technique? So the Tao technique here is the true Tao. Who should I listen to? Could it be that I went the wrong way just now? As soon as this thought arose, he instantly felt his mind in a mess. The conflict between these two Tao techniques made him suspect that he might have gone the wrong way, but he also felt that something was wrong. He couldn't help but fall into an alternation of self-denial and self-affirmation. If he couldn't straighten out these and understand the Tao that he was pursuing, then he wouldn't be able to walk out from this place. He would only be trapped in this state of mind, unable to extricate himself. On the other side, Duan Cheng was currently standing on a spirit boat, heading towards the sects that had already submitted to the spirit of creation Tao technique. He wouldn't think about the big picture like Elder Yuan, but he knew that if the spirit of creation Tao technique was left unchecked, then it would spread more and more, causing endless harm. If he didn't pay attention to it now, then he would have to pay a greater price if he wanted to pacify it in the future. The reason why he brought Meng Hu along was because he was the only one who could possibly resolve the spirit of creation Tao technique. Originally, his original idea was to directly eradicate all these sects, so that he would be able to eliminate all future troubles. But after thinking about it again, he felt that this was somewhat inappropriate. Even if these sects had cultivated the spirit of creation Tao technique, it had only been less than 10 years, so they weren't too deep into it. The best way was to convince this generation to let them know that this kind of Tao technique wasn't tolerated by the current world, and then find a way to make this generation give up the memory of this Tao technique, so that they wouldn't have to go on a killing spree. He turned around and saw Meng Hu leaning on the side of the boat, playing with a jumping civet cat. He walked up and said sincerely, "Guardian Meng, I want to apologize to you here. Previously, you used a scheme to trap the spirit of creation in the ferocious monsters. If I hadn't been meddlesome and went to rescue this person, then perhaps there wouldn't have been such a thing. Guardian Meng, I've been biased against you in the past. I'm sorry, I hope that you won't take it to heart." Meng Hu, ugh. Duan Cheng looked down and said with a heavy expression, "This is the evil that I, Duan Cheng, planted, so I should be the one to end this evil karma. If I can't, I won't go back to the sect." Not long after, the Dermic boat stopped above the Daxing Gate. Duan Cheng had already investigated thoroughly. This was the place where Yao Kanbei had first settled down, and the Tao technique that he had passed down had been passed down here for the longest time. Some people might already be intoxicated by this Tao and unable to extricate themselves. However, he would still try to persuade them. If they persisted in going about things the wrong way, then he would be ruthless and let the other sects see clearly that although he was willing to reason with them, he was not a soft-hearted person. Duan Cheng pointed in the direction of the Daxing Gate and said, "Guardian Meng, I'm not good with words, so I'll have to rely on you for this matter. Just do as you say. If this person doesn't listen, then I, Duan Cheng, will come forward to clean up the mess. Act according to my wishes." Meng Hu thought for a moment and suddenly said, "I understand." He placed the little civet cat to the side and pressed down on the cat's head. Then, he turned around and headed down the mountain. In the land of creation, Xiang Ju was guiding the Weili. Suddenly, he noticed that there was a slight change in the guiding force. Although it was very small, it was very obvious in his eyes. Seeing that there was actually an additional force involved, he couldn't help but feel a little interested. He calculated and found that this was because the number of people who were spreading the Tao technique of the spirit of creation had increased, causing the guiding force to increase imperceptibly. Seeing that the Vedanta beside him also noticed the slight change here, he smiled and said, "I didn't think that the Tao technique of the spirit of creation would also take the initiative to guide the Weili." Wei Ming pondered for a moment and said, "If we take the initiative to promote this matter, can we make the incarnation of the spirit of creation Weili come faster?" The earlier the spirit of creation Weili came, the less power it accumulated, and the more advantageous it was for them. Of course, it couldn't be too little, otherwise, it was very likely that the previous incident would repeat itself. But this time, they didn't have to worry about it, because after the purple-robed Taoist was suppressed by them, it was temporarily impossible for him to transmit his thoughts to the original Weili. So this time, it would definitely be a Weili incarnation that was comparable to the Vedanta. Heng Wu said, "If it's just the matter itself, it wouldn't be difficult, but Fengdu doesn't want us to cause trouble, so I'm afraid he won't allow us to do this. Here, only Bushutian is not under his control, but it doesn't matter if we Weili enter Bushutian. If we go too much, Daoist Xianyuan will definitely stop us." Ji Zhuang smiled and said, "Then let's tell Daoist Xianyuan about this. This is to deal with the spirit of creation, and it will also benefit Daoist Xianyuan. If he knows about this, he might open the door and allow us to do it." Wei Ming pondered for a moment and said, "We can give it a try. If he doesn't agree, then forget it." Xiang Ju looked at Ji Zhuang and said, "Daoist Ji Zhuang, you've interacted with Daoist Xianyuan a few times, so you should be able to transmit your divine will to him. I'll leave this matter to you." Ji Zhuang said in a low voice, "I'm only passing on a message for you. As for whether it will succeed, I can't guarantee it." Xiang Ju said with a smile, "Of course, as long as you pass on the message for us." Ji Zhuang nodded and immediately activated his divine will. In the Qinghuan Palace, Zhang Yan felt a strand of divine will arrive. After a brief examination, he realized that the person who transmitted the divine will was Ji Zhuang. He guessed that something was up, so he brought him over. Ji Zhuang immediately turned inexplicable. When he saw Zhang Yan's figure, he cupped his hands and said, "Daoist Xianyuan, greetings." Zhang Yan returned the greeting and said, "You're looking for me, is there something you need?" Ji Zhuang immediately told him the purpose of his visit. After listening, Zhang Yan shook his head slightly. Since this person wanted to kill the clone of the spirit of creation, then he should just wait patiently. Always making a fuss over these small details was completely neglecting the essentials. Even if the spirit of creation that fell into the hands of the Whaley was powerful and this person couldn't resist it, he wouldn't just sit and watch. Thus, there was no need for him to waste time on this. Actually, just like Hongdu, no matter how you change, I'll only take the path that I think is the most correct. I'll directly identify the root of the problem, which is just now, and regardless of whether I succeed or not, at least I won't deviate from the right path. He said calmly, "You may leave." Ji Zhuang didn't pester him. He was only responsible for passing on the message. Whether it succeeded or not was not within his consideration. He cupped his hands and left.